Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, there's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to go. This is a gentle, unhurried journey through daily life in ancient Rome, from the quiet moments before dawn, through the rhythms of work, family, and city life, and slowly into the calm of night. The story is told softly and slowly, with no sudden sounds or interruptions, so you can relax, unwind, or simply drift off to sleep. Make yourself comfortable, and when you're ready, we'll begin. The ancient city of Rome, a place unlike any other in the world of its time. Imagine, if you will, a city stretching across 7 hills, home to perhaps more than 1 million souls. 1 million people, gathered together in a space that would have felt both impossibly vast and impossibly cramped all at once. This was Rome at its height, a living, breathing organism of humanity, pulsing with life from the break of dawn until long after darkness fell. To walk through Rome was to walk through a city that never truly rested. The streets, narrow and winding, threaded between buildings that rose several stories high, creating shadowed corridors where the sun rarely touched the ground. These weren't the broad, planned avenues we might imagine when we think of Roman grandeur. No, the everyday streets of Rome were tight, crowded spaces, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other. And yet through these cramped arteries flowed the lifeblood of the empire. The noise of Rome was legendary even in its own time. Imagine the constant rumble of wooden cartwheels over stone pavement, the sharp crack of a whip urging oxen forward, the calls of street vendors advertising their wares in voices worn rough from years of shouting. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The splash of water at the public fountain. The laughter and arguments spilling out from the doorways of taverns. Children playing in the streets, their voices bright and clear above the deeper sounds of commerce and labor. Rome was never quiet, never still. But beneath all this activity, beneath the apparent chaos of daily life, there ran a deep structure, an order that every Roman understood from birth. This was a society built upon hierarchy, upon knowing one's place in the great pyramid of Roman life. At the very top stood the patricians, the ancient aristocratic families who could trace their lineage back to the founding of Rome itself. These were the families who had always held power, who owned vast estates, who filled the Senate and the highest offices of state. Their names were known to everyone. Their wealth was almost incomprehensible to the average Roman. Below the patricians came the plebeians, the common citizens of Rome. But even within this category, there were gradations, subtle distinctions that mattered deeply. Some plebeians were wealthy merchants or successful craftsmen, living in comfortable homes, their children educated, their futures secure. Others scraped by on the edge of poverty, living day to day, their survival dependent on their labor and the occasional generosity of wealthier patrons. Yet all plebeians shared one crucial thing in common: they were citizens. They had rights. They could vote, though the value of that vote varied greatly depending on their wealth. They could own property. They could, in theory at least, rise in the world. Then there were the freedmen and freedwomen, those who had once been slaves but had somehow gained their liberty. Perhaps they had purchased their freedom with years of saved wages. Perhaps they had been freed in their master's will as a reward for faithful service. Perhaps they had been freed for reasons known only to their former owners. These freedmen occupied a peculiar space in Roman society. They were no longer slaves, yet they were not quite fully Roman either. They carried the taint of their former status, a shadow that followed them even as they built new lives. Some freedmen became quite wealthy, successful in business or trade, yet they could never fully escape their past. Their children, however, born free, could become full citizens, the stain of slavery washed away by a single generation. And at the bottom of this social pyramid were the slaves. Hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps even more, permeating every level of Roman society. They were everywhere, doing everything. In the homes of the wealthy, slaves cooked and cleaned and dressed their masters. In the workshops, slaves labored alongside free workers, their skills often indistinguishable, their legal status entirely different. In the fields of great estates far from Rome, gangs of agricultural slaves harvested grain and tended olive groves under the watchful eyes of overseers. In the mines, slaves worked in conditions of unimaginable horror, their lives measured in months rather than years. Yet slavery in Rome was not always what we might imagine. Some slaves lived lives of relative comfort, particularly those who served in wealthy households or who possessed valuable skills. An educated Greek slave who served as a tutor to his master's children might live better than a poor free man struggling to survive in the Subura, Rome's notorious slum district. A slave accountant or secretary might exercise considerable authority on behalf of his master. This doesn't make slavery any less dehumanizing, any less unjust, but it does remind us that the reality of Roman life was complex, full of contradictions that would have been apparent to anyone walking those crowded streets. These social divisions shaped every interaction, every transaction, every moment of daily life in Rome. The patrician and the slave might pass each other on the street, but they lived in entirely different worlds, even as they shared the same city. The plebeian merchant and the freedman might do business together, but the law saw them differently, treated them differently, allowed them different possibilities. And yet, for all its rigid hierarchy, for all its noise and crowding and inequality, Rome had something that made it unique, something that gave shape and rhythm to the year in a way that transcended social class. The Romans loved their holidays. They loved their festivals. They loved any excuse to pause from the grinding routine of daily labor and gather together for celebration, for religious observance, for spectacle and entertainment. More than 100 days of the year were set aside for religious festivals and public holidays. Think about that for a moment. More than 100 days when normal work was supposed to stop, when the temples would be crowded with worshippers, when processions would wind through the streets, when the theaters and the circus would be filled with spectators. Some of these festivals were ancient, their origins lost in the mists of time before Rome was even Rome. Others were more recent, instituted to honor a particular god or to commemorate a military victory or to celebrate the emperor and his family. On these festival days, the character of the city would shift. The constant press of commerce would ease, if not stop entirely. People would put on their finest clothes, what finery they had. They would gather at temples to watch priests perform ancient rituals, sacrificing animals to the gods, reading the future in the organs of sheep and cattle. They would crowd into the Circus Maximus to watch chariot races, screaming themselves hoarse as they cheered for their favorite teams, the blues or the greens, the reds or the whites. They would fill the theaters to watch comedies and tragedies, to see pantomimes and acrobatic performances. These festivals created a rhythm to the Roman year, a pattern that everyone knew, that everyone anticipated. The cycle of religious observance and public celebration gave structure to time, marked the passage of seasons, connected the Romans of the present to the Romans of the distant past who had first instituted these rites. In a city of such vast disparities, where the rich and poor lived such different lives, these festivals were one of the few things that truly belonged to everyone, that gathered the entire population together in shared experience. And so this was Rome. 1 million souls or more, pressed together in a space both magnificent and squalid, governed by strict hierarchies yet united by shared traditions. A city of marble temples and wooden tenements, of senators in togas and slaves in tunics, of constant noise and occasional moments of sacred silence. A city where every single day, thousands upon thousands of individual stories unfolded, stories of ambition and resignation, of hope and despair, of the ordinary and the extraordinary happening side by side. This was the stage upon which daily life in ancient Rome played out, day after day, year after year, century after century. This was the world into which Romans were born, in which they lived and worked and loved and struggled, and in which, eventually, they died. And it all began with the rising of the sun over those 7 hills, calling another day into being in the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. As dawn broke over Rome, light would touch first the red tile roofs of the city, then gradually descend to illuminate the streets below. But the quality of that morning light, the way it entered one's home, the very nature of the space in which a Roman awoke, all of this depended entirely on where you stood in the intricate hierarchy of Roman society. For the wealthy, for those fortunate patricians and successful plebeians who had accumulated substantial fortunes, the day began in spaces of remarkable comfort and beauty. These were the residents of the domus, the single-family home that represented not just shelter, but status, dignity, and a connection to Roman tradition stretching back centuries. To own a domus was to possess something more than just a building. It was to have a private world, a sanctuary from the chaos of the streets outside. Picture, if you will, the typical domus of a wealthy Roman family. You would enter through a heavy wooden door set into a plain exterior wall. The Romans, you see, didn't display their wealth on the street-facing facades of their homes. Privacy mattered. Security mattered. The treasures of the house were kept inside, away from the envious eyes of passers-by. But once you crossed that threshold, once you stepped into the interior of the domus, everything changed. The first space you would encounter would be the atrium, the heart of the Roman home. This was a large, open room, its ceiling pierced by a rectangular opening called the compluvium, through which rainwater would fall into a shallow pool below, the impluvium. Imagine standing in that space on a quiet morning, watching as the light streamed down through that opening, illuminating the pool, casting dancing reflections on the painted walls. The atrium was where the family would receive guests, where business might be conducted, where the master of the house would greet his clients each morning in the ancient ritual of the salutatio. Around this central atrium, rooms would radiate outward. Bedrooms, called cubicula, were often small, intimate spaces, furnished simply with beds and chests for storage. Romans didn't spend much time in their bedrooms except for sleeping. The dining room, the triclinium, was far more important, a space designed for the elaborate dinner parties that were so central to Roman social life. And beyond these rooms, in many domus, would be the garden, the peristyle, an open courtyard surrounded by columns, planted with flowers and herbs, perhaps containing a fountain or small pool. Here, in this private outdoor space, the wealthy Roman could escape the noise of the city entirely, could walk among greenery, could breathe air sweetened by blossoms rather than fouled by the smell of too many people living too close together. The floors of such homes might be decorated with intricate mosaics, tiny colored tiles arranged into geometric patterns or elaborate scenes from mythology. The walls would be painted in vivid colors, reds and yellows and blues, often depicting garden scenes or architectural illusions that made rooms appear larger than they were. There would be running water, piped in from the city's aqueducts, flowing to fountains in the garden, perhaps even to a private bath. In winter, some rooms might be heated by a hypercaust system, warm air flowing beneath raised floors, providing comfort even in the coldest months. This was gracious living. This was space and beauty and comfort. but this was available only to a tiny fraction of Rome's population. For the vast majority of Romans, home was something entirely different. Home was an insula, one of the massive apartment buildings that dominated the city's landscape, housing hundreds of thousands of people in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. The word insula means island, and these buildings did indeed rise like islands above the narrow streets of Rome, blocking out the sky, creating permanent twilight at street level. They could climb 5, 6, 7, even 8 stories into the air, each floor projecting slightly beyond the one below, the upper stories looming over the streets in a way that made the already narrow passages feel even more constricted. Walk through the working-class neighborhoods of Rome, through areas like the Subura or across the Tiber, and you would find yourself surrounded by these towering structures. They were built quickly, cheaply, with profit rather than safety as the primary concern. The materials were often substandard. The construction was hurried. Landlords sought to maximize the number of rental units they could squeeze into each building, and they cared little for the comfort or safety of their tenants. The ground floor of an insula was different from the floors above. Here, facing the street, might be shops and workshops, the tabernae where merchants sold goods and craftsmen plied their trades. The rooms on the ground floor were larger, better built, with direct access to the street. They might even have running water, or at least easy access to the public fountain just outside. These ground floor apartments were relatively desirable, and consequently, they were expensive, affordable only to the more successful among the common people, the plebeians who had managed to accumulate some wealth, the freedmen whose businesses were thriving. But climb the stairs, those narrow, dark staircases that led to the upper floors, and the quality of the living spaces declined with each step upward. The higher you climbed, the smaller the apartments became. The higher you climbed, the more basic the accommodation. The higher you climbed, the cheaper the rent, and consequently, the poorer the tenants. On the upper floors of an insula, a family might rent a single room, or at most 2 or 3 rooms, reached by climbing 5 or 6 flights of stairs in near darkness. These apartments were basic in the extreme. Walls of thin wood or plaster partition separated one unit from another, offering little privacy. Sound traveled easily through these flimsy barriers. You would hear your neighbors' conversations, their arguments, their intimate moments. You would hear the crying of their children, the sounds of their meals, the rhythm of their lives pressed up against your own. And the amenities, or rather, the lack of them. Most apartments in an insula had no running water. If you wanted water, you carried it up those flights of stairs from the public fountain in the street below. Think about that for a moment. Think about the labor involved in hauling heavy buckets of water up 5 or 6 flights of stairs, multiple times a day, every day, just to have water for drinking, for cooking, for washing. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of Romans. Most apartments had no kitchen, no fireplace, nothing that could be used for cooking. The risk of fire was simply too great in these cramped wooden buildings. Instead, Romans living in insulae would buy their food already prepared from the countless food stalls and taverns that lined the streets. Hot food, ready to eat, purchased a meal at a time. Or they might eat bread and cheese and olives, foods that required no cooking, that could be consumed cold. And toilets, most apartments had no toilets. Instead, residents would use chamber pots, which would then need to be emptied, their contents tossed into large jars placed on the street for that purpose, or into the public sewers, or, in the case of the most inconsiderate, simply dumped out the window into the street below. The smell in these buildings, particularly in summer, must have been overwhelming. The smell of too many people living in too small a space, with inadequate sanitation, inadequate ventilation, the windows small or non-existent to provide any privacy from the buildings across the narrow street. And then there was the danger. These buildings were constructed so quickly, so cheaply, with such disregard for structural integrity, that collapse was a constant threat. Every year, buildings would simply fall down, sometimes without warning, bringing stories of apartments crashing down on the stories below, crushing residents in their sleep or as they went about their daily activities. Imagine living with that fear, that knowledge that the very building providing you shelter might at any moment become your tomb. But perhaps even more terrifying than collapse was fire. In a city built largely of wood, where people cooked with open flames, where oil lamps provided the only light after dark, where the buildings were pressed so tightly together that flames could leap from one structure to the next, fire was the great nightmare of Rome. And the insulae, with their wooden construction, their narrow staircases, their upper floors so high above the ground, were terrible fire traps. Once a fire started in an insula, it could spread with horrifying speed, racing up through the building, trapping residents on the upper floors with no means of escape. The wealthy in their domus had the option of fleeing to their gardens, of escaping through multiple exits. Those on the ground floors of insulae could break through windows or rush outdoors to the street. But those on the 5th or 6th or 7th floor, they had nowhere to go but down staircases already filled with smoke and flames, or out windows that were too high for survival. Fire in Rome was a constant threat, a disaster that could strike without warning, consuming entire neighborhoods, leaving thousands homeless in a matter of hours. And yet, despite all of this, despite the danger and the discomfort and the lack of basic amenities, these insulae were home to the majority of Rome's population. This is where people lived their lives, where they raised their children, where they loved and argued and hoped and dreamed. They made do with what they had because they had no other choice. They carried water up those endless flights of stairs because their families needed water. They lived with the fear of fire and collapse because they needed a roof over their heads, and this was what they could afford. There was a vast gulf between the experience of waking up in a domus and waking up in an upper-floor apartment of an insula. A gulf of comfort, of safety, of dignity. The patrician in his domus, surrounded by beauty and space, could hardly imagine the reality of life 6 stories up in a creaking, crowded building across the city. And the tenant of that high apartment, carrying water up dark stairs, living always with the smell and the noise and the fear, could only dream of the gardens and mosaics and running water that belonged to another world entirely. This was the architecture of inequality in Rome. This was how the city housed its million inhabitants, some in spacious comfort, most in crowded precariousness. And every morning, both the wealthy and the poor would emerge from their very different homes into the same chaotic streets, to begin another day in the great city. The city never truly slept, but there was a moment, deep in the heart of the night, when Rome grew as quiet as it would ever be. A brief interlude of relative silence, when even the most dedicated revelers had stumbled home, when the taverns had finally closed their doors, when exhaustion claimed even those whose poverty or worries had kept them wakeful. But this quietness was fleeting, measured in minutes rather than hours, because Rome was a city that belonged more to the early morning than to the night. Long before the sun thought about rising, long before its first rays touched the eastern horizon, the city began to stir. Not all at once, but gradually, like a great beast slowly opening its eyes, stretching its limbs, preparing for another day of ceaseless activity. The first sounds were the carts. During the daylight hours, wheeled traffic was banned from most of Rome's streets. The passages were simply too narrow, too crowded with pedestrians and vendors and the general press of humanity to accommodate carts and wagons as well. But once darkness fell, once the streets emptied somewhat, the carts could enter the city, rumbling in from the countryside and from the port of Ostia, laden with goods that Rome consumed in vast quantities. Grain and wine, oil and vegetables, building materials and merchandise of every description. These carts were pulled by oxen or mules, and the sound of their passage was extraordinary. The wooden wheels, iron-rimmed, rolled over the stone paving of the streets with a deep, grinding rumble that seemed to shake the very buildings. The sound echoed and re-echoed off the walls of the insulae rising on either side of the narrow streets, amplified and distorted, filling the darkness with noise. And the drivers, perched atop their loads or walking alongside their animals, would shout to one another, would curse the narrowness of the passages, would crack their whips to urge reluctant beasts forward. For those trying to sleep in the apartments above, this was torture. The poet Juvenal complained bitterly about the noise of nighttime Rome, about how the rumble of carts and the shouting of drivers made sleep impossible. And he was writing from experience, from long nights lying awake in the darkness, listening to the city below, unable to escape the cacophony even in his own home. The carts would continue their work for hours, unloading at warehouses and markets, maneuvering through streets barely wide enough to contain them, sometimes becoming stuck, creating chaos and congestion that would take hours to untangle. And all of this happened in darkness, or at most in the flickering light of oil lamps and torches, adding danger to the difficulty. But as the night slowly gave way to the very earliest hints of dawn, as the eastern sky began to shift from black to the deepest blue, other sounds joined the rumble of the carts. The city was waking up, and with it came the workers whose labor began before sunrise, whose trades depended on an early start. The bakers were among the first. In shops throughout the city, in the ground floors of insulae and in standalone bakeries, fires were being lit, ovens were being heated. The bakers had to begin their work in the deepest hours of the night, because bread took time to make, and Romans expected fresh bread to be available from the moment the sun rose. Dough had to be mixed and kneaded, had to be left to rise, had to be shaped and baked. The whole process took hours, and it had to be timed perfectly so that the first loaves would be coming out of the ovens just as customers began to arrive. The smell of baking bread would begin to drift through the streets, cutting through the other smells of the city, a warm, yeasty, comforting scent that promised sustenance, that reminded people, even in their sleep, that a new day was beginning. And the sounds from the bakeries added to the growing symphony of the awakening city. The scrape of the wooden paddle as the baker slid loaves into the oven. The crackle of the fire. The voices of the bakers and their assistants, calling to one another, coordinating their work. Bread was the staple of the Roman diet, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Rich and poor alike depended on bread, though the quality varied greatly depending on what you could afford. The wealthy might eat bread made from the finest wheat flour, white and soft and delicious. The poor made do with coarser bread, sometimes made from barley or mixed grains, dark and dense and filling but lacking the refinement of the better grades. But whatever the quality, everyone needed bread, and the bakers of Rome worked through the night to provide it. As the bakers worked, others were beginning to emerge into the streets. The city's water carriers were among the earliest risers, because their labor was essential and time-consuming. Remember, most Romans living in the insulae had no running water in their apartments. They depended on the public fountains scattered throughout the city, and they depended on their own labor, or the labor they could hire, to bring that water from the fountains to their homes. The public fountains of Rome were marvels of engineering, fed by the great aqueducts that brought fresh water from springs in the hills and mountains outside the city. The water flowed constantly, day and night, spilling from bronze or stone spouts into large basins, always fresh, always cool, never stopping. These fountains were gathering places, social hubs where people would meet and talk and exchange news and gossip. But in the early morning, before the crowds arrived, the fountains belonged to the water carriers. These were often slaves, sent by their masters to fetch water for the household. Or they might be hired laborers, men and women who made their living carrying water for those who could afford to pay someone else to do this heavy work. Or they might be the residents of the insulae themselves, hauling their own water because they had no other choice and no money to pay someone else to do it. They would arrive at the fountains carrying containers of various sorts. Large clay amphorae that could hold substantial quantities of water, balanced on shoulders or carried on poles between two people. Smaller jugs and pitchers for those who had to carry the water themselves and couldn't manage the weight of the larger vessels. Leather bags that could be filled and slung over shoulders. Whatever container they had, they would fill it from the fountain, the water splashing and echoing in the pre-dawn quiet, creating its own music, a liquid counterpoint to the rumble of carts and the sounds of the bakers at work. And then would come the journey back, hauling heavy containers through the awakening streets, navigating the obstacles and hazards, making their way to the insulae, and then facing those stairs. 5 flights, 6 flights, sometimes more, climbing up and up with the weight of the water pulling at shoulders and backs and legs. And knowing that this wasn't a one-time task, but something that would need to be repeated multiple times throughout the day, because water was consumed constantly, for drinking and cooking and washing, and there was no way to store large quantities in the cramped apartments above. Think about beginning your day this way. Think about your first task each morning being to haul water up 6 flights of stairs before you could even think about eating breakfast or beginning your actual work. This was the reality for countless Romans, a daily burden so common that it was simply accepted as part of life, not even worth complaining about because everyone in your circumstances faced the same challenge. As the water carriers made their rounds and the bakers continued their work, other craftsmen and laborers were beginning to stir. The city's workshops would soon be opening, and many craftsmen liked to get an early start, to make the most of the daylight hours, to get ahead of the day's work before the heat became oppressive or before customers began arriving with their demands and distractions. In workshops throughout Rome, you would begin to hear the sounds of various trades beginning their daily labor. The ring of a hammer on metal as a blacksmith began heating his forge, preparing to shape iron into tools or weapons or decorative pieces. The rasp of a saw as a carpenter began cutting wood for furniture or construction. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a cobbler's hammer as he attached soles to shoes. The scrape and grind of a miller's stones, crushing grain into flour. Each trade had its own distinctive sound, its own rhythm, and all of these sounds began to layer upon one another as the city woke up. The narrow streets and alleyways acted like echo chambers, amplifying and bouncing these sounds, sending them up to the apartments above, making it impossible for anyone to continue sleeping once the city truly began its day. And through it all, winding between the carts and the water carriers and the early rising craftsmen, came the street vendors, those entrepreneurs who made their living selling small goods and services to their fellow Romans. Some would be setting up stationary positions, claiming the same spot they occupied every day, unfolding their portable tables or spreading their wares on cloths laid on the ground. Others would begin to walk the streets, calling out their offerings, their voices adding to the growing chorus. Fresh fish. Fresh fish from Ostia. Vegetables. Finest vegetables. Hot wine. Warm yourself with hot wine. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, commerce was beginning, because there were always people who needed something, always someone willing to pay for convenience, for goods brought to them rather than having to go to the market themselves. The city was still dark, or at most lit by the gradually strengthening pre-dawn light, but it was no longer quiet. The rumble of carts, the calls of vendors, the sounds of craftsmen at work, the splash of water at the fountains, the crackle of fires in the bakeries, the murmur of voices as more and more people emerged into the streets, all of this combined into a symphony of urban life, a soundscape that was uniquely Roman, that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent time in the city. For those still trying to sleep, curled up on thin mattresses in their cramped apartments high above the streets, sleep was becoming impossible. The noise simply wouldn't allow it. You could cover your ears, could bury your head in your pillow, could curse the city and all its inhabitants, but the noise would find you anyway, seeping through the thin walls, rising from the streets below, inescapable and relentless. And so, one by one, people would give up the fight. They would rise from their beds, would splash water on their faces from the pitcher filled the night before, would prepare to join the flow of humanity in the streets below. Another day in Rome was beginning, whether they were ready for it or not. The sun still hadn't risen. The sky was growing lighter, the deep blue of late night giving way to the softer blue of approaching dawn, but the sun itself remained hidden below the eastern horizon. And yet Rome was already fully awake, already engaged in the countless activities that kept the city functioning, that fed its people and supplied its needs and maintained its position as the greatest city in the world. This was the rhythm of Rome, a rhythm dictated not by the sun but by necessity, by the needs of 1 million people packed into a dense urban space, by the requirements of commerce and survival. The city couldn't wait for sunrise to begin its work. There was simply too much to do, too many mouths to feed, too many tasks that required early starts and long hours. And so Rome woke in darkness, and by the time the sun finally rose, the city was already hours into its day, already humming with activity, already deep into the complex dance of urban life that would continue until darkness fell again and the cycle began anew. Within the walls of Roman homes, whether the spacious domus of the wealthy or the cramped apartments of the insulae, family life was governed by structures and traditions that had endured for centuries. These were not matters left to individual choice or personal preference. The organization of the Roman family, the distribution of power within it, the roles and responsibilities of each member, all of this was defined by law and custom, passed down through generations, as fundamental to Roman identity as the Latin language itself. At the head of every household stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. This was not simply a father in the sense we might understand today. The paterfamilias held a position of authority that extended far beyond what we might consider normal parental power. Under Roman law, the paterfamilias had absolute legal authority over everyone in his household. His wife, his children, his grandchildren if his children were still living under his roof, the slaves who served the family, even adult sons who had married and had children of their own but who still lived within the family home, all of them were subject to his authority. This power, called patria potestas, was immense and, in its earliest forms, had been almost unlimited. A paterfamilias could legally kill his own children if he chose, though by the imperial period this extreme right was rarely exercised and would have been viewed with horror by most Romans. But the principle remained. The paterfamilias controlled all property owned by the family. Even if a son earned money through his own labor or his own business ventures, technically that money belonged to his father. The paterfamilias arranged marriages for his children, decided which infants born into the family would be accepted and raised and which would be rejected, determined the shape and direction of the family's future. Imagine being a grown man, perhaps 30 or 40 years old, with a wife and children of your own, and yet still subject to your father's authority in all legal matters. Still unable to own property in your own name. Still requiring your father's permission for major decisions. This was the reality for many Roman men, because the paterfamilias retained his authority until his death. Only then would his sons finally achieve legal independence, would finally become patres familias themselves, heads of their own families, possessing the same absolute authority over their own households that their father had held over them. And yet, for all this legal authority, for all this power concentrated in the hands of one man, the reality of daily life in a Roman household was often more complex, more nuanced than the law might suggest. Because while the paterfamilias held legal power, much of the actual running of the household, the daily management of domestic life, fell to the women of the family. The wife of the paterfamilias, the materfamilias, occupied a position that was both subordinate and essential. Under Roman law, she remained under guardianship all her life, first under her father's authority, then, upon marriage, under her husband's. She could not vote, could not hold political office, could not engage in most forms of legal business without a male guardian acting on her behalf. In the most traditional form of Roman marriage, called marriage with manus, a wife passed completely from her father's authority to her husband's, becoming in legal terms almost like a daughter to her husband. But within the household, the materfamilias wielded considerable practical authority. She managed the domestic affairs, oversaw the slaves who cooked and cleaned and maintained the home, made decisions about daily expenditures, about meals and clothing and the countless small matters that kept a household functioning smoothly. In wealthy families, the materfamilias held the household keys, a symbol of her authority over the stores and supplies, her responsibility for ensuring that nothing was wasted, that everything was properly accounted for. She would rise early, perhaps before the sun, and begin organizing the day's activities. Which slaves would be assigned to which tasks? What meals would be prepared? What needed to be purchased from the market? She might inspect the work of the household slaves, checking that the floors had been swept properly, that the water had been brought up from the fountain, that the lamps had been filled with oil. In wealthier households, she might spend time on more refined pursuits, working at her loom, creating cloth for the family's clothing, a task that retained deep symbolic importance even for women who could afford to buy ready-made cloth and garments. The children of the household would be waking as well, their morning routines depending on their age and their family's social standing. Young children might still sleep in their parents' room or in a room with a trusted slave who watched over them during the night. Older children, particularly in wealthy families, might have their own small rooms, though privacy as we understand it was not something Romans particularly valued. The family was meant to be together, to operate as a unit, not to fragment into isolated individuals. Before the day's activities truly began, before breakfast was eaten or the children were sent off to school or the paterfamilias departed to attend to his business, many Roman families would pause for a moment of religious observance. This took place at the lararium, the household shrine that could be found in virtually every Roman home, whether grand domus or modest apartment. The lararium was often a small niche in the wall, or a cupboard-like structure, sometimes elaborately decorated with paintings, sometimes quite simple. Within it would be small statuettes or paintings representing the lares, the guardian spirits of the household, and the penates, the spirits who protected the family's food stores and ensured prosperity. There might also be images of ancestors, particularly illustrious members of the family who had achieved fame or high office, their presence a reminder of the family's lineage and the standards to which the current generation was expected to aspire. The morning prayer at the lararium was typically brief, a moment of connection with the divine forces that Romans believed watched over their homes and families. The paterfamilias might lead the prayer, or it might be the materfamilias, or they might do it together, their children gathered around them. They might light a small oil lamp before the shrine, might leave a small offering, perhaps a bit of food or wine, a token of respect and gratitude to the household gods. These prayers were not the grand, elaborate rituals of the state religion, with its animal sacrifices and priestly hierarchies. This was domestic religion, intimate and personal, a quiet acknowledgement that the family depended not just on its own efforts but on divine favor, on the goodwill of forces beyond human control. The Lares and Penates were not distant, abstract deities. They were part of the household, as familiar as the furniture, as essential as the walls and roof. To neglect them would be to invite disaster, to risk losing their protection. The prayers might ask for protection during the day ahead, for success in business ventures, for the health and safety of family members. They might give thanks for blessings already received, for food on the table, for a roof overhead, for the continuation of the family line. The words might vary from day to day, or they might follow traditional formulas passed down through generations. What mattered was not eloquence but sincerity, the maintenance of the relationship between the family and its protective spirits. And then, the prayer completed, the family would turn to the first meal of the day. Breakfast, called ientaculum, was not the substantial meal that we might be accustomed to in our own time. Romans saved their appetite and their elaborate dining for later in the day, for the main meal that would be eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. The ientaculum was meant simply to break the night's fast, to provide enough sustenance to begin the day's activities without weighing down the stomach or consuming too much time in preparation or eating. For most Romans, breakfast was a simple affair. Bread was the foundation, as it was of almost every Roman meal. This might be leftover bread from the previous day, or fresh bread purchased from the baker whose shop occupied the ground floor of the insula, or bread baked in the household's own oven if they were wealthy enough to have one. The bread might be dipped in wine to soften it, a practical solution for bread that had gone a bit stale, and the wine provided calories and a bit of pleasant flavor to start the day. There might be fruit, if the season was right and if the family could afford it. Figs or dates, grapes or apples, depending on what was available in the markets. Or there might be a bit of cheese, sharp and salty, eaten with the bread. Some families might prepare a simple porridge, pulse, made from grain boiled with water or milk, perhaps flavored with a bit of honey if they had it, or with salt for those who preferred savory to sweet. Wealthy families might have a slightly more elaborate breakfast, with olives and honey, perhaps some cold meat left from the previous evening's dinner, maybe eggs if the household kept chickens. But even among the wealthy, breakfast remained relatively simple. This was not the time for elaborate cooking or lengthy dining. The day awaited, with all its demands and obligations, and breakfast was merely the fuel needed to begin engaging with those demands. The family might eat together, gathered in the atrium if they lived in a domus, or crowded into their small apartment if they lived in an insula. Or they might eat separately, the paterfamilias taking his breakfast quickly before rushing off to business, the children eating under the supervision of their mother or a slave, each person's schedule dictating when and how they took this first meal. As they ate, they might discuss the day ahead. The paterfamilias might mention appointments he needed to keep, clients he needed to see, business that required his attention. The materfamilias might talk about what needed to be purchased at the market, about tasks that needed to be completed around the house. Children might be reminded of their obligations, their lessons if they were of school age, their duties within the household. Slaves would be eating their own simple breakfast, often the same bread and perhaps some porridge, taken quickly before they began the day's work. In wealthy households, there might be many slaves, each with specialized duties. The slave who managed the household accounts and correspondence. The slaves who cooked and cleaned. The slave who accompanied the master when he went out, carrying his belongings and running errands. The slave who tutored the children. Each would need to be fed and ready to perform their assigned tasks, and the morning was when these assignments would be confirmed, when the day's work would be organized and distributed. In poorer households, there might be no slaves at all, and the work fell to the family members themselves. The children might be sent to fetch water from the public fountain, or to run errands, or to help with whatever work the parents did to earn their living. The line between childhood and adulthood was not as sharp in Rome as it might be today. Children were expected to contribute to the family's welfare from a young age, to learn their parents' trade or to help with domestic tasks, to be useful members of the household rather than simply dependents to be cared for. And so the morning advanced, the household moving from sleep to waking, from private religious observance to the simple sharing of bread and wine, from the intimate space of family to preparation for engaging with the wider world outside. The structure of the family, with the paterfamilias at its head, provided order and stability. The morning rituals, both religious and domestic, connected each day to the days that had come before, linked each family to Roman traditions stretching back centuries. There was comfort in this predictability, in knowing one's place, in following patterns established by countless generations. But there was also constraint, particularly for those who lacked power within the family structure. The son who chafed under his father's continuing authority. The wife who managed the household but could not own property in her own name. The daughter whose marriage would be arranged to suit her family's interests rather than her own preferences. The slave whose very life was not their own. Yet this was the framework within which Romans lived, the structure that organized their most intimate relationships, that shaped their daily experiences from the moment they woke until they returned to sleep. And now, breakfast completed, prayers offered, the household began to disperse, each member moving out into the city to fulfill their roles, to engage with the vast, complex, chaotic world that existed beyond the family's threshold. The paterfamilias to his business, the materfamilias to her domestic management, the children to their studies or their play or their work, all of them carrying with them the influence of the family structure that had shaped them, that defined their place in the intricate hierarchy of Roman society. As the morning light grew stronger, as the streets of Rome filled with people emerging from their homes to begin the day's business, the city became a stage upon which the intricate dance of Roman social hierarchy played out in countless interactions, obligations, and exchanges. Nothing in Rome happened in isolation. Every relationship was embedded in a web of expectations and duties, of favors given and received, of loyalty offered and protection extended. This was a society built not just on formal legal structures, but on personal connections, on networks of obligation that bound people together across the divisions of class and status. At the heart of this system was the relationship between patron and client, a bond so fundamental to Roman society that it shaped the rhythm of each day, determined how Romans spent their mornings, influenced everything from politics to business to social standing. To understand a day in ancient Rome, you must understand this relationship, must grasp how it functioned, how it was maintained, how it created a structure of mutual obligation that permeated every level of society. The patron was a man of wealth and influence, a member of the upper classes, someone with resources to share and power to wield. He might be a senator, his family ancient and distinguished, his wealth measured in vast estates and countless slaves. Or he might be a successful merchant or businessman, a plebeian who had accumulated substantial fortune and now sought to translate that wealth into social influence and political power. Whatever the source of his status, the patron had clients, men of lesser means who depended on his support and protection. The client might be a poor plebeian, struggling to support his family, needing occasional financial help to get through difficult times. Or he might be a freedman, formerly enslaved, now free but lacking the resources and connections to truly succeed without a patron's backing. Or he might be a man of moderate means, comfortable enough but not wealthy, who needed a patron's influence to advance his interests, to secure advantageous marriages for his children, to gain appointments to desirable positions. The relationship between patron and client was not one of equals. It was fundamentally hierarchical, built on inequality, on the patron's superior position and the client's need. But it was also reciprocal. The patron provided material support, financial assistance, legal protection, and the use of his influence on the client's behalf. The client, in return, offered loyalty, political support, and the enhancement of the patron's prestige through his very attendance and deference. Every morning, this relationship was renewed and reinforced through a ritual that was as much a part of Roman life as the rising of the sun itself. This was the salutatio, the morning reception, when clients would gather at their patron's home to pay their respects, to receive whatever small gifts or assistance the patron might offer, and to demonstrate their loyalty and attachment. Imagine the scene in the pre-dawn hours at the home of a wealthy patron. The domus would already be prepared, slaves having cleaned and arranged everything perfectly. The atrium would be ready to receive visitors, its floor swept, its impluvium clear and reflecting what light filtered in from above. The patron himself would have risen early, would have dressed with particular care, because the salutatio was a public performance, an opportunity to display his wealth and status to an audience that would carry their impressions out into the wider city. He would not dress himself, of course. Slaves would attend to this task, helping him into his tunic, arranging the folds of his toga with practiced precision. The toga, that vast semicircle of white wool, was the formal garment of the Roman citizen, and wearing it properly required skill and assistance. It had to drape just so, the folds falling in the approved manner, the fabric sitting correctly on the shoulders. A badly draped toga was a mark of poverty or provincialism, suggesting you couldn't afford slaves who knew how to dress you properly. And then, as the sky began to lighten, the clients would start to arrive. They would gather outside the patron's door, waiting for the appointed hour when they would be admitted. This was not a casual affair. The clients would also have dressed carefully, would have put on their own togas if they were citizens, would have done everything possible to present themselves well. To appear before your patron in slovenly dress or with uncombed hair would be an insult, a sign of disrespect that might damage the relationship. When the doors opened, the clients would enter in order of importance. The wealthiest and most distinguished clients first, those whose attendance brought the most prestige to the patron. Then the middling clients, the solid citizens who made up the bulk of the patron's following. Finally, the poorest clients, those who depended most desperately on the patron's support but who brought him the least social benefit. Everyone knew the order, knew their place in the hierarchy even among clients. To try to enter out of turn would be to invite humiliation, to be publicly reminded of one's inferior status. Inside the atrium, the patron would greet each client, sometimes individually if the client was important enough, sometimes in groups if they were less distinguished. There would be conversation, carefully calibrated to each client's status. A wealthy client might be invited to discuss politics or business, might be treated almost as an equal, at least for the duration of the conversation. A poor client might receive only a brief greeting, a formulaic exchange of pleasantries that acknowledged his presence without requiring much of the patron's time or attention. And then would come the sportula, the small gift that the patron would distribute to his clients. In earlier times, this had been actual food, a basket of provisions that the client could take home to feed his family. But by the imperial period, it had usually become a small sum of money, perhaps 25 arses, enough to buy food for the day but hardly a fortune. Some clients depended on this daily sportula for survival, going from patron to patron if they had multiple such relationships, collecting enough small gifts to scrape together a living. Others accepted it more as a token, a symbol of the relationship rather than a necessity. But whether the client needed the money desperately or merely accepted it out of custom, receiving the sportula was in some ways humiliating. It was a public acknowledgement of dependence, of inferiority, of the fact that you needed this man's help to survive. And yet it was also necessary, not just for the material support it provided, but because refusing to participate in the salutatio, refusing to acknowledge your patron with your daily attendance, would be to break the relationship entirely, to lose whatever protection and influence it provided. The patron, for his part, benefited enormously from this morning ritual. Each client who appeared at his door was a demonstration of his importance, his influence, his position in society. The more clients you had, the more powerful you appeared. And these clients were not just ornamental. They were expected to provide real support. If the patron needed votes in an election, his clients were expected to vote as he directed and to encourage others to do the same. If the patron was involved in a lawsuit, his clients might attend the trial as a show of support, filling the courtroom with their presence. If the patron appeared in public, his clients might accompany him through the streets, creating an impressive entourage that announced to everyone watching just how important this man was. This system of patronage extended throughout Roman society, creating chains of obligation that linked the highest to the lowest. A great senator might have dozens or even hundreds of direct clients, each of whom might in turn have their own clients of even lower status. A wealthy freedman might be the client of a patrician patron, while simultaneously acting as patron to poorer freedmen or to slaves he had freed himself. The entire society was woven together by these threads of mutual obligation, creating a network that was both supportive and constraining, that provided security but at the cost of independence. The freedman occupied a particularly complex position within this system. These were men and women who had been born into slavery, had spent years or even decades as someone else's property, but had somehow achieved freedom. Perhaps they had saved enough money to purchase their freedom, setting aside small sums over many years until they had accumulated the price their owner demanded. Perhaps they had been freed in their master's will, a final gift upon his death. Perhaps they had been manumitted for some specific service or achievement, granted freedom as a reward. Whatever the path to freedom, the freedman carried the mark of slavery forever. Roman law required that a freedman maintain certain obligations to his former master, who now became his patron in a formal legal sense. The freedman owed his former master respect and service, might be required to continue working for him in some capacity, had to attend him at the salutatio like any other client. More than this, the freedman faced social prejudice that no amount of success could entirely erase. Romans looked down on anyone who had been enslaved, considering them fundamentally inferior to those born free, tainted by their servile past. And yet, freedmen could and did achieve remarkable success. Some became wealthy through business and trade, accumulating fortunes that rivaled those of freeborn citizens. They worked as shopkeepers, selling goods from small shops built into the ground floors of insulae. They worked as craftsmen, their skills honed during their years of slavery now deployed for their own profit. They worked as clerks and secretaries, their literacy and numeracy valuable in a society where such skills were not universal. Some freedmen became so wealthy that they themselves became patrons, supporting their own clients, wielding influence in their communities. But no matter how successful they became, they could never entirely escape their past. They could never hold high political office, could never become senators or magistrates. Their children, born free, would have fewer restrictions, would be able to climb higher in Roman society. But the freedmen themselves remained marked, their status always somehow lesser than that of the freeborn, no matter their wealth or achievements. At the bottom of this entire hierarchy were the slaves, those who had no freedom at all, who were property rather than persons in the eyes of Roman law. They were everywhere in Rome, performing every conceivable type of labor. In the wealthy domus, slaves cooked and cleaned, carried messages, managed accounts, tutored children, attended to their master's every need. In shops and workshops throughout the city, slaves worked alongside free laborers, their status different but their work often identical. In the countryside, on the great agricultural estates, slaves toiled in the fields, producing the grain and wine and oil that fed the empire. Some slaves lived lives of relative comfort, particularly those with valuable skills or those who served in wealthy households where their masters treated them with some degree of kindness. An educated Greek slave who tutored his master's children might be well-fed, well-housed, given considerable autonomy in managing his teaching duties. A talented cook might take pride in his skills, might enjoy a certain status within the household. A slave accountant might manage vast sums of money on his master's behalf, might wield considerable practical authority even while remaining legally a piece of property. But other slaves lived in conditions of unspeakable hardship. Those who worked in the mines, deep underground in darkness and danger, survived on average only a few years before the brutal conditions killed them. Those who labored in the fields in chain gangs, watched over by overseers ready with whips and clubs, endured lives of grinding misery with little hope of escape. Those who served cruel masters might be beaten or worse for any infraction, real or imagined, with no legal recourse, no protection, no one to appeal to for help. All of these people, patrons and clients, freedmen and slaves, wealthy and poor, moved through the same city, walked the same streets, existed in the same urban space. But they inhabited fundamentally different worlds, shaped by the rigid hierarchies that governed every interaction, every relationship, every possibility for the future. The patron in his fine toga, surrounded by his clients, wielded power and influence that shaped the lives of dozens or hundreds of people. The slave carrying water up 6 flights of stairs had no power at all, no control even over his own body, his very life belonging to another. And yet the system functioned, day after day, year after year, century after century, because everyone understood the rules, understood their place, understood what was expected of them. The patron provided protection and support. The client offered loyalty and service. The freedman worked to build a new life while never quite escaping his past. The slave endured and hoped for freedom, or at least for a master who was not cruel. This was the social machinery of Rome, intricate and pervasive, simultaneously sustaining the city and constraining everyone within it. As the morning rituals concluded, as the patrons dismissed their clients and the household prayers were completed and breakfast was consumed, the city of Rome shifted into its working rhythm. This was when the true business of the day began, when the vast machinery of urban life engaged fully, when hundreds of thousands of people set about the labor that sustained them and their families, that kept the city functioning, that produced the goods and services upon which this enormous population depended. The Roman workday followed the sun. There were no clocks as we would understand them, no precise measurement of hours that remained constant throughout the year. Instead, the Romans divided daylight into 12 hours, regardless of the season, which meant that an hour in summer, when the days were long, lasted much longer than an hour in winter, when darkness came early. But this variability didn't trouble the Romans. They rose with the sun and worked while light permitted, and the exact duration of an hour mattered less than the natural rhythm of day and night. For most working people, the actual labor of the day would last roughly 6 hours, from sunrise or shortly thereafter until around midday, when the heat became oppressive and energy flagged and it made sense to pause, to rest, to escape the worst of the afternoon sun. This was not a short workday by any means. 6 hours of physical labor, of standing in a shop serving customers, of working metal or wood or stone, of hauling goods or building structures or any of the countless tasks that needed doing. This was exhausting work, made more so by the heat and the crowding and the constant noise of the city. The plebeians, the common citizens of Rome, were the backbone of this working world. They were the artisans and craftsmen whose skills kept the city supplied with everything it needed. The blacksmiths who forged tools and weapons, who repaired broken implements, who shaped iron into countless useful forms. The carpenters who built furniture and roof beams and scaffolding. The potters who created the amphorae and plates and cups that every household required. The leather workers who made shoes and belts and bags. The weavers who turned thread into cloth, the fullers who cleaned and processed that cloth, the tailors who transformed it into garments. Each of these trades required years of learning, years of practice to develop the skills that made you valuable, that allowed you to earn a living. A boy who would become a blacksmith didn't simply walk into a forge one day and begin working iron. He started young, perhaps at 7 or 8 years old, as an apprentice to a master craftsman. He would spend years learning, first doing the simplest tasks, pumping the bellows to keep the fire hot, sweeping the floor, running errands, watching and absorbing the techniques. Gradually he would be allowed to attempt more complex work, always under supervision, always subject to correction when he made mistakes. The apprenticeship might last until the boy reached his late teens or early 20s, years of learning that bound him to his master, that taught him not just the technical skills of the craft but also the business of it, the knowledge of how to deal with customers, how to price work, how to manage materials and time. And when the apprenticeship was complete, when the master judged that the boy had become skilled enough to work independently, then he might set up his own workshop, might begin to take his own apprentices, might establish himself as a master craftsman in his own right. Or he might continue to work for his former master, now as a skilled employee rather than an apprentice, earning wages, building a reputation, saving money against the day when he might afford to open his own shop. The path to independence was long and uncertain, and many craftsmen never achieved it, spending their entire working lives as employees rather than owners, skilled but not prosperous, secure in their trade but never quite achieving the success they might have hoped for. The shops where these craftsmen worked were not like the enclosed, climate-controlled commercial spaces we might be familiar with. Roman shops, called tabernae, were typically small, open-fronted spaces built into the ground floors of the insulae that dominated the city. During business hours, the front of the shop would be completely open to the street, perhaps protected by a wooden counter but otherwise exposed to the air, to the noise, to the constant flow of pedestrians passing by. This openness meant that commerce and street life blended seamlessly. A customer didn't enter a shop so much as pause at it, stepping up to the counter to examine goods or discuss a commission. The craftsman worked in full view of anyone walking past, his labor a kind of advertisement, demonstrating his skill to potential customers. A blacksmith's hammer ringing on the anvil, a carpenter's saw biting into wood, a potter's hands shaping clay on the wheel, all of this was visible, audible, part of the sensory experience of walking through a Roman neighborhood. The noise from these shops added to the constant din of the city. The hammering and sawing and voices raised to be heard over the general clamor. Shopkeepers calling out to passers-by, trying to attract their attention, to lure them to examine goods. Fine leather work. Best prices in Rome. Fresh bread. Still warm from the oven. Shoes repaired while you wait. The aggressive salesmanship was relentless, a necessity in a competitive market where dozens or even hundreds of shops might be selling similar goods, where attracting customers meant being louder, more persistent, more visible than your competitors. At night, these open shop fronts would be closed with heavy wooden shutters, secured with locks and bars against thieves. But during the day, the shops were as much a part of the street as the street itself, creating a permeable boundary between public and private space, between commerce and community. People would linger at shops, gossiping with the shopkeeper, exchanging news, discussing the events of the day. The shop was not just a place of business but a social hub, a point of connection in the neighborhood. Some plebeians worked not in shops but in construction, and Rome in the imperial period was constantly building, constantly expanding, constantly repairing and renovating. There were temples to be built, public buildings to be erected, insulae to be constructed to house the ever-growing population, roads to be paved, aqueducts to be maintained. This work required enormous numbers of laborers, men who would spend their days hauling stone and mixing mortar and lifting beams, working under the direction of skilled architects and engineers who planned the projects. Construction work was hard, dangerous, and not particularly well paid, but it was available, and for men without specialized skills, it provided a way to earn a living. The work was irregular, dependent on whether there were projects underway, on the weather, on the availability of materials. A construction worker might labor every day for months when a major project was in progress, then find himself unemployed when that project was completed, scrambling to find his next job, perhaps taking whatever work he could find in the meantime, loading and unloading cargo at the docks, moving goods in warehouses, anything to earn enough to feed his family until the next construction job came along. Down at the Tiber, along the docks and warehouses that lined the river, other workers were engaged in the endless task of moving goods. Rome consumed vast quantities of material, far more than could be produced locally. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, wine from throughout the Mediterranean, olive oil from Spain, exotic luxuries from the far reaches of the empire and beyond. All of this arrived by ship, first at the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, then transferred to smaller river boats that could navigate up the river to Rome itself. The dock workers who unloaded these boats performed back-breaking labor. Heavy amphorae filled with wine or oil had to be lifted, carried, stacked in warehouses. Sacks of grain had to be shouldered and hauled to storage facilities. There were no cranes, no machinery to ease the work. Human muscle and the occasional help of draft animals were all that was available, and so men strained and sweated under the weight of goods, working in crews, coordinating their efforts, cursing the heat and the weight and the endless stream of ships that needed unloading. This work, like construction, was often performed by the poorest plebeians, men without the skills or capital to establish themselves in a trade, men for whom physical labor was the only commodity they had to sell. But slaves also worked alongside free men at the docks and in the warehouses, their labor directed by their masters or by masters who hired them out to work for others, pocketing the wages while the slaves received only their basic maintenance. Throughout all of these workplaces, in the shops and construction sites and warehouses, children were present, contributing their labor to the family's survival or learning trades that would support them in adulthood. Childhood as a protected period of life devoted primarily to play and education was a luxury that most Roman families could not afford. Children were economic assets, contributors to the household from a young age, and putting them to work was not considered cruel but simply practical. A boy of 7 or 8 might already be working in his father's shop, learning the family trade, starting with simple tasks but gradually taking on more responsibility. Or he might be apprenticed to another craftsman, sent away from his family to live in his master's household, to work and learn under the master's direction. The apprenticeship contract would bind the boy for years, obligating him to obedience and labor in exchange for training and basic care. For families too poor to apprentice their sons to skilled trades, boys might work as general laborers, running errands, hauling water, helping in whatever capacity their small size and strength permitted. They might work in the streets selling small goods, calling out their wares in high, clear voices that could cut through the urban noise. They might work in the public baths, helping customers with their clothing, providing services for small tips. Any work that could earn even a few coins was worth doing, because those coins might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Girls, too, worked, though their labor was more likely to be domestic. They would help their mothers with cooking and cleaning and childcare, would learn to spin and weave, would acquire the skills they would need when they married and had to manage households of their own. Some girls from poor families might work as servants in wealthier households, earning small wages that they would turn over to their parents. For most girls, formal education was not even a consideration. They would learn what they needed to know from their mothers and other female relatives, practical skills that would serve them in their expected roles as wives and mothers. For boys from families with slightly more resources, there might be school, at least for a few years, learning to read and write and do basic arithmetic, skills that could open doors to slightly better employment, to work as clerks or secretaries rather than as manual laborers. But even for these boys, school occupied only part of the day, and they might work before or after their lessons, contributing to the family's income even while pursuing education. As the morning advanced toward midday, as the sun climbed higher and the heat intensified, the pace of work in shops and construction sites and warehouses would gradually slow. The blacksmith's hammer would ring less frequently, the carpenter would pause more often to wipe sweat from his brow, the dock workers would move with less urgency, conserving energy for the afternoon that might still require some labor, though less than the morning had demanded. The 6 hours from sunrise to midday represented the most productive period of the day, when energy was highest, when light was good but heat had not yet become overwhelming, when the city was at its most industrious. Thousands upon thousands of individual workers, each pursuing their own livelihood, each contributing their small part to the vast economic engine that was Rome. The cumulative effect of all this labor, all these individual efforts, was the maintenance of a city that could not possibly have functioned without it. The wealthy might look down on those who worked with their hands, might consider manual labor degrading, suitable only for slaves or the lower orders. But the reality was that Rome depended utterly on this labor. Without the bakers rising in the dark to make bread, without the water carriers hauling water up endless stairs, without the blacksmiths and carpenters and construction workers and dock workers and countless others plying their trades, the city would have ground to a halt within days. The senators and patricians might make the laws and conduct the politics, but the plebeians and slaves and freedmen did the work that kept everyone alive, that kept the city functioning, that transformed raw materials into useful goods and maintained the infrastructure upon which urban life depended. And so they worked, morning after morning, year after year, some taking pride in their skills, others simply enduring, all of them aware that this labor was their survival, their contribution to family and community, their place in the vast, complex, hierarchical society that was Rome. The work was hard, the rewards often meager, the prospects for advancement limited. But it was work, and work meant survival, meant the ability to feed yourself and your family, meant having a place in the city, however humble, however precarious. As midday approached, as the morning's labor drew toward its close, workers would begin to think ahead to the break that was coming, to the meal and rest that would occupy the middle hours of the day, to the brief respite before whatever work the afternoon might bring. The rhythm of the workday was as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the movement of the sun across the sky, and it would continue tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, as long as strength held and circumstances permitted, as long as Rome endured. In the midst of all this labor, in the midst of the ceaseless activity that defined Rome from dawn until dusk, there existed another world, one inhabited by the city's children. Not all children, of course. Many, as we have seen, were already working, already contributing their labor to their family's survival, already learning trades through apprenticeship or helping in their parents' shops or performing the countless small tasks that poverty demanded. But for the children of families with resources, for those whose parents could afford to delay their entry into the working world, childhood meant something different. It meant school. Education in Rome was not a public responsibility, not something provided by the state or guaranteed to all citizens. If you wanted your child educated, you had to pay for it yourself, had to find a teacher and negotiate a fee and make arrangements for your child to attend. This immediately limited education to those families who had the money to spare, who could afford to forego their children's potential labor in exchange for the promise of future advantages that literacy and learning might bring. For boys from free families of moderate or comfortable means, formal education typically began around the age of 7. Before that age, children were considered too young for serious instruction, their minds not yet ready for the discipline and concentration that learning required. They would spend their early years at home, playing, absorbing the rhythms of household life, beginning to understand their place in the family and in the broader social world. But at 7, or thereabouts, their education would begin in earnest. The most basic level of schooling was provided by a teacher called a literator or ludi magister, the teacher of the ludus, the elementary school. This teacher was often a freedman, someone who had received education while enslaved, perhaps as a household tutor to his master's children, and who now used that education to earn a living. The social status of these teachers was not high. Teaching young children was not considered prestigious work, and the pay was often meager, barely enough to support the teacher and his own family. But it was work that required no capital beyond knowledge, and for a freedman seeking to establish himself after manumission, teaching was a viable option. The ludus itself was not a building in the sense we might imagine a school. It might be nothing more than a roped-off area under a colonnade, or a room rented in an insula, or even a spot in a public space where the teacher would gather his students. There were no desks, no elaborate furnishings. Students sat on benches or stools, or sometimes simply on the ground, gathered around their teacher, their attention demanded by his voice and, when necessary, by the rod he kept close at hand. The children would arrive early in the morning, often accompanied by a slave called a pedagogus, whose job was to escort the child to school, to carry his materials, to ensure he arrived safely and behaved appropriately. The pedagogus would often remain during lessons, watching to make sure his young charge paid attention, ready to report any misbehavior back to the child's father. The materials of education were simple. Each student would have a wax tablet, a wooden frame filled with dark wax, and a stylus, a pointed metal instrument for scratching letters into the wax. The wax could be smoothed over with the flat end of the stylus, allowing the same tablet to be used again and again, errors erased, new lessons written over old ones. These tablets were the notebooks of the ancient world, portable, reusable, perfectly suited to the endless practice that learning required. The first task was learning letters. The teacher would recite the alphabet, and the students would repeat it, their young voices chanting in unison, A, B, C, D, on and on through the 23 letters that the Romans used. This would be repeated endlessly, day after day, until the sequence was burned into memory, until any student could recite it without thought, forward and backward, starting from any point. Then would come the painstaking work of learning to write those letters, to scratch them into the wax with the stylus, to form each character properly, to space them correctly. The teacher would demonstrate, would write a model for the students to copy, and they would practice, over and over, their small hands gripping the stylus awkwardly at first, gradually developing the control needed to produce legible writing. Simultaneously, they would be learning to read, starting with simple words, learning to recognize how letters combined into syllables, how syllables formed words, how words conveyed meaning. The process was slow, repetitive, often tedious. There were no colorful picture books, no engaging stories designed to capture children's interest. The texts used for instruction were often lists of words, moral maxims, brief passages from poets that were considered appropriate for young students. Learning to read meant decoding these texts, word by word, until the skill became automatic, until reading no longer required conscious effort. Arithmetic was taught through similar methods of repetition and memorization. Students learned to count, to add and subtract, to work with Roman numerals, those combinations of letters that represented numbers. I for 1, V for 5, X for 10, L for 50, C for 100. Learning to calculate with Roman numerals was more cumbersome than with the Arabic numerals we use today, but Roman students mastered it through practice, through countless exercises scratched into their wax tablets, errors corrected with the flat end of the stylus, the work done again until it was right. And throughout all of this, discipline was maintained through the threat and reality of corporal punishment. The teacher kept a rod or a cane close at hand, and students who failed to pay attention, who made too many mistakes, who talked when they should have been silent, who showed any form of disrespect or disobedience, could expect to feel it across their hands or legs or backs. This was not considered cruel but merely necessary, the only effective way to impose order on a group of restless children, to force them to concentrate on material that was often dull and difficult. Some teachers were more liberal with punishment than others, some quicker to anger, some more creative in devising humiliating consequences for misbehavior. Students might be beaten, forced to stand for long periods, required to memorize additional passages as punishment, subjected to public ridicule before their classmates. The learning environment was strict, unforgiving of weakness or inattention, designed to instill not just knowledge but obedience, discipline, the ability to endure discomfort and persist in difficult tasks. For many boys, this elementary education was all they would receive. After a few years, perhaps by age 11 or 12, they would leave the ludus, their basic literacy and numeracy considered sufficient for whatever work they would do as adults. They might enter apprenticeships, might begin working in their father's businesses, might take up whatever occupation circumstances and family connections made available. They could read contracts, could do basic accounting, could write letters if necessary. This was enough for most purposes, enough to function as a citizen, to manage practical affairs, to avoid being cheated by those who could read when you could not. But for boys from wealthier families, for those whose parents had higher ambitions, education continued beyond the elementary level. At around age 12, these boys would move on to study with a grammaticus, a teacher of grammar and literature, someone whose own education was much more extensive, whose social status was correspondingly higher, and whose fees were substantially greater. The grammaticus would introduce students to the great works of Latin literature, and to Greek literature as well, since educated Romans were expected to be bilingual, to have mastered Greek as thoroughly as their native Latin. Students would read the poets, Virgil and Horace and Ovid, would analyze their verses, would memorize long passages, would learn to appreciate the structure and artistry of great writing. They would study the historians, learning about Rome's past, about the great men and great events that had shaped the empire. They would read moral philosophy, absorbing the ethical teachings that Romans considered essential to proper character formation. This education was about more than just knowledge. It was about forming young men into the kind of Romans who could take their place among the elite, who could participate in public life, who could uphold the traditions and values that defined Roman civilization. The texts they studied were chosen not just for literary merit but for moral instruction, for the examples they provided of virtue and vice, of proper conduct and behavior to be avoided. For those destined for political careers, for the sons of senators and wealthy equestrians who would be expected to speak in the forum, to argue cases in court, to participate in the Senate's debates, education would extend to a final level, study with a rhetor, a teacher of rhetoric and oratory. This was the highest form of education available in Rome, focused on the art of persuasive speaking, on the techniques of argument and performance that were essential to success in public life. Students of rhetoric would learn the structure of speeches, the different types of arguments, the methods of appealing to an audience's emotions and reason. They would practice delivering speeches on imaginary topics, taking positions on hypothetical legal cases or political questions, honing their skills under the critical eye of the rhetor. They would memorize examples of great oratory from the past, would study the speeches of Cicero, would learn to emulate the masters while developing their own style and voice. This training in rhetoric was intensely practical, designed to produce men who could dominate in the competitive arena of Roman public life, who could win cases in court, sway votes in elections, command attention in the Senate. The ability to speak well, to argue persuasively, to present oneself with confidence and authority, these were skills that could make or break a political career, and wealthy families invested heavily in ensuring their sons received the best possible training. But what of the girls? What of the daughters born into these same wealthy families, whose brothers received this extensive, expensive education? For them, the picture was entirely different. Most girls received no formal education at all. They were not sent to schools, were not given teachers of grammar or rhetoric. Instead, their education took place at home, under the supervision of their mothers and other female relatives. They learned the skills they would need as wives and mothers, the domestic arts that defined a Roman woman's proper sphere. They learned to spin and weave, to manage household slaves, to supervise the preparation of meals, to keep household accounts, to maintain the standards of cleanliness and order that a respectable home required. Some girls from elite families might receive instruction in reading and writing, might be taught by household slaves who served as tutors, might even study some literature and learn to play musical instruments. But this was supplementary to their primary education in domestic management, and it was never intended to prepare them for public life or professional careers. Women did not speak in the forum, did not argue cases in court, did not participate in political debate. Their influence, when they had it, was exercised privately, through relationships with fathers and husbands and sons, not through direct engagement in public affairs. The assumption underlying this differential treatment was clear and unchallenged in Roman society. Men were destined for public life, for business and politics and the law, and they needed education to prepare them for these roles. Women were destined for domestic life, for managing households and raising children, and they needed different skills, learned through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. The idea that girls might benefit from the same education as boys, that they might have intellectual capacities equal to their brothers, that they might use education for purposes beyond managing a household, these ideas would have struck most Romans as absurd, contrary to nature and to the proper order of society. And so Roman children grew up in sharply different worlds, shaped from their earliest years by expectations that diverged based on gender and social class. The elite boy destined for a political career spent years studying rhetoric, preparing to speak before crowds, to argue and persuade and command. His sister learned to weave and to supervise slaves, to be a credit to her future husband, to raise children who would honor the family name. The plebeian boy entered an apprenticeship at 7 or 8, learning a trade that would support him throughout his life. His sister learned from her mother, preparing for a life of domestic labor that would be harder and more precarious than that of her wealthy counterpart, but no less defined by expectations of female domesticity. Education, or the lack of it, was one of the primary mechanisms through which Roman society reproduced itself, through which each generation learned the roles they were expected to play, through which inequality was naturalized and perpetuated. The schoolroom, with its wax tablets and strict teachers and endless repetition, was where young Romans learned not just to read and write, but to be Romans, to understand their place in the social hierarchy, to accept the limitations and possibilities that their birth had determined for them. As the morning's labor drew toward its close, as the sun climbed toward its zenith and the heat of midday began to make itself felt in earnest, the character of Rome shifted once again. The intensity of work began to ease, and people's thoughts turned toward sustenance, toward the meal that would occupy the middle of the day, toward the markets and food stalls where the city's vast population acquired the provisions that kept them alive. Rome was a city of consumers. Unlike the small towns and villages scattered throughout the empire, where most people grew at least some of their own food, where households were largely self-sufficient, Rome produced almost nothing of what it consumed. The million people packed into the city depended entirely on food brought from elsewhere, from the countryside of Italy and from provinces scattered across the Mediterranean. Every day, the city consumed thousands of loaves of bread, countless amphorae of wine and oil, mountains of vegetables and fruit, quantities of fish and meat that would have staggered the imagination of anyone from a smaller community. Feeding Rome was a logistical challenge of extraordinary complexity, and it was accomplished through a combination of private commerce and state intervention, of free markets and public subsidies, of individual enterprise and imperial policy. And the physical manifestation of this system, the place where ordinary Romans encountered it most directly, was the market. Markets existed throughout the city, in the great public forums and in smaller neighborhood squares, temporary and permanent, chaotic and vital. The largest and most famous was the Forum Romanum itself, the ancient heart of the city, though by the imperial period much of its space was occupied by temples and public buildings rather than commercial stalls. But nearby, the forums of the various emperors, and especially the markets of Trajan, provided vast covered spaces where vendors could sell their goods protected from the weather, where customers could browse and bargain and purchase what they needed. But most Romans didn't shop in these grand public spaces. They bought their food closer to home, in the smaller markets that served individual neighborhoods, in the streets where vendors set up temporary stalls, in the shops built into the ground floors of the insulae. The city was dotted with these smaller points of commerce, ensuring that no one had to travel far to find food, that even in the poorest neighborhoods, basic provisions were available, though the quality and variety might be limited compared to what was on offer in wealthier districts. Walking through a Roman market around midday, you would be assaulted by sensation. The noise, first of all, the constant clamor of vendors calling out, advertising their wares, competing for customers' attention. Fresh bread, baked this morning. Olives from Spain, the finest you'll taste. Wine, good wine, better than you'll find anywhere else. The vendors would shout and gesture, would hold up their products for inspection, would engage in the rapid-fire patter of experienced salesmen who knew that attracting attention was half the battle. And the crowds, pressing close together in the narrow spaces between stalls, jostling and pushing, everyone trying to see what was available, to assess quality, to find the best price. Customers would pick up produce, would squeeze fruit to test ripeness, would smell fish to ensure freshness, would taste wine before committing to a purchase. There was no passive browsing in a Roman market. Shopping was an active, physical, demanding activity, requiring assertiveness and a willingness to fight for position, to hold your ground against the press of other shoppers, to negotiate vigorously for favorable prices. The smells of the market were intense and varied. The yeasty warmth of fresh bread from the bakeries. The sharp, salty tang of olives, preserved in brine, sold from large jars. The fruity smell of olive oil. The pungent, almost overwhelming odor of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used to flavor almost everything, a condiment so ubiquitous that no kitchen was without it, despite its extremely strong smell that many found unpleasant until they'd grown accustomed to it. There would be vegetables, whatever was in season. Onions and garlic, leeks and turnips, cabbage and lettuce, beans and lentils. The variety changed with the seasons, and Romans ate what was available, what was fresh, what grew in the current time of year. There was no expectation of year-round availability of all foods. You ate what the season provided, and you looked forward to the particular delicacies that each time of year brought. Fruit would be available from vendors who specialized in it. Apples and pears, figs and dates, grapes by the bunch or dried into raisins. In summer, there might be melons, and in autumn, pomegranates. Some fruit was imported from distant provinces, luxuries that commanded high prices. But most of what was sold in the markets was grown relatively close to Rome, in the countryside of Italy, brought into the city by farmers and merchants who understood the constant demand, the endless appetite of the urban population. Wine was everywhere in the market, sold from amphorae, the large clay vessels in which it was transported and stored. Customers could taste before buying, could purchase just enough for a day or two, or could buy larger quantities if they had the money and the storage space. The quality varied enormously. The cheapest wine was harsh and sour, barely drinkable even when heavily diluted with water, but it was cheap, affordable even to the poor, and it provided calories and a mild intoxicating effect that made hard lives slightly more bearable. Better wine, from renowned regions, properly aged, carefully produced, could be smooth and pleasant, a luxury that the wealthy enjoyed, but that was beyond the reach of most Romans. Romans almost never drank their wine undiluted. To do so was considered barbaric, the mark of someone with no civilization, no refinement. Instead, wine was mixed with water, sometimes in equal parts, sometimes with even more water than wine, creating a beverage that was refreshing, mildly alcoholic, and safe to drink. The water in Rome, supplied by the aqueducts, was generally clean and reliable, but mixing it with wine was an extra precaution, and it also made the wine go further, stretching expensive wine into more servings, making it affordable to consume throughout the day. But not everyone could afford to shop in the markets to purchase all the food their families needed. Rome had a substantial population of poor citizens, people who lived on the edge of survival, who worked when they could find work but who often struggled to earn enough to feed themselves and their children. For these people, the state provided a crucial supplement in the form of the grain dole, a distribution of free grain to eligible citizens. This program, the annona, had begun centuries earlier and had gradually expanded until, by the imperial period, it provided grain to something like 200,000 people, perhaps a fifth of the city's population. The grain came from Egypt and North Africa, from the great grain-producing provinces of the empire, shipped across the Mediterranean in enormous grain freighters, then distributed to eligible citizens from state warehouses. To receive the grain dole, you had to be a citizen, and you had to be registered on the official lists. This was not a program for everyone in need, only for citizens, and even then, only for a limited number. But for those who qualified, the monthly distribution of grain was the difference between survival and starvation, a guarantee that, no matter how little money you had, you would at least have grain to make bread, the staple that formed the foundation of the Roman diet. The grain was distributed as whole grain, not as bread, which meant that recipients had to grind it into flour themselves or pay to have it ground, then bake it or pay a baker to bake it for them. This added labor and expense somewhat reduced the benefit of the free grain, but it was still an enormous help, freeing up whatever small income people had to purchase other necessities, to buy vegetables or oil or the other components of a minimally adequate diet. For many Romans, particularly those living in the upper floors of the insulae where there were no kitchens, where cooking was impossible, the solution to the midday meal was not to prepare food at home but to purchase it ready-made from the countless food stalls that lined the streets. These establishments, called thermopolia, were everywhere in Rome, small shops with large clay jars set into stone counters, the jars filled with hot food, stews and porridges and vegetables cooked in advance and kept warm, ready to be ladled into bowls for customers who needed a quick, cheap meal. The food served at thermopolia was simple, designed to be filling and affordable rather than refined or delicious. Bean stew, thick and hearty, flavored with herbs and perhaps a bit of pork if you were lucky. Porridge made from grain, eaten hot, sometimes sweetened with honey or flavored with cheese. Vegetables cooked until soft, seasoned with garum and oil. This was working-class food, the fuel that kept labours going, that fed children and slaves and anyone else who needed to eat but couldn't prepare food themselves. The thermopolia were social spaces as well as commercial ones. People would gather at the counter, eating standing up or perched on stools, talking with the proprietor and with other customers, exchanging gossip and news, taking a brief break from the demands of the day. Some thermopolia had small back rooms where customers could sit more comfortably, could linger over their meal, perhaps accompanied by a cup of wine. These establishments served something of the function that cafes or pubs might serve in other societies, providing not just food and drink but community, connection, a place to be among others rather than alone. As people ate their midday meals, whether purchased from markets and consumed at home or bought from thermopolia and eaten in the street, the city around them continued its complicated existence. And one of the most obvious, most unavoidable aspects of that existence was the waste, the garbage, the accumulated detritus of 1 million people living in close quarters with inadequate sanitation. The streets of Rome were not clean. They were repositories for waste of all kinds, organic and inorganic, animal and human. Households would toss their garbage out windows or doors into the street below, where it would accumulate until someone, either private citizens tired of the mess or public slaves assigned to the task, would clear it away, or until rain would wash it into the sewers. But the clearing was never complete, never thorough enough to keep pace with the constant generation of new waste, and so the streets remained dirty, littered with rotting food scraps, broken pottery, the dung of the animals that pulled carts and carried loads through the city. The smell in the streets, particularly in summer, particularly in the poorer neighborhoods where resources for cleaning were most scarce, must have been overwhelming. The reek of garbage decomposing in the heat, the sharp ammonia smell of urine, the overwhelming stench from the fulleries where urine was collected and used in the processing of cloth, the general miasma of too many people and too many animals and too much waste, all concentrated in too small a space. Romans grew accustomed to these smells, learned to breathe through their mouths when passing particularly offensive spots, accepted the filth as simply part of urban life, unavoidable and unremarkable. But visitors from the countryside, or from smaller, cleaner towns, would have been struck by the sensory assault, by the intensity of the smells and sights that were part of daily existence in the great city. The public fountains, constantly flowing with fresh water from the aqueducts, provided some relief, some opportunity for washing, for rinsing away the worst of the dirt. And the public latrines, where Romans would sit side by side on stone seats, conversing casually while attending to their bodily needs, at least concentrated some of the waste in specific locations where it could flow into the sewers rather than being deposited randomly in the streets. But these facilities were limited, and many Romans, particularly the poor living in the upper floors of insulae, relied on chamber pots that would then be emptied into jars in the street or, in the most inconsiderate cases, simply dumped out windows, with only a shouted warning to alert passers-by to the incoming deluge. This was the reality of urban life in ancient Rome, a reality that included not just the impressive public buildings and monuments, not just the sophisticated political and legal systems, not just the literature and art and engineering, but also the dirt and smell and unsanitary conditions that were the inevitable consequence of packing so many people into a limited space with the technology and infrastructure available at the time. And yet Romans persisted, adapted, made lives for themselves in these challenging conditions. They shopped in the crowded markets, navigating the press of bodies and the cacophony of competing vendors. They purchased their meals from thermopolia, eating quickly before returning to whatever work the afternoon might require. They depended on the grain dole when they needed it, standing in long lines at distribution points, receiving their monthly allotment of grain that would keep their families fed. They drank their watered wine throughout the day, finding small pleasures where they could, maintaining the routines and rhythms that gave shape to their existence. As midday passed, as the heat reached its peak and then gradually began to ease, as meals were consumed and the worst of the afternoon's torpor set in, the city would enter a brief period of relative quiet, a pause before the later afternoon and evening would bring new activities, new obligations, new opportunities for work and pleasure and the complicated business of living in the greatest city the ancient world had ever known. As the afternoon heat began to moderate, as the intense glare of midday gave way to the softer light of later hours, many Romans would turn their attention to one of the most distinctive and important features of their daily lives, the baths. The public bathhouses, the thermae, were not just places to get clean, though certainly cleanliness was part of their purpose. They were social institutions, community centers, places where Romans of all classes could mingle, relax, exercise, gossip, conduct business, and participate in rituals of hygiene and sociability that defined what it meant to be Roman. The great imperial bath complexes that dotted the city were among the most impressive buildings in Rome, rivaling even the temples and forums in their scale and grandeur. These were enormous structures, capable of accommodating thousands of bathers at once, their interiors decorated with colored marble, elaborate mosaics, statuary brought from Greece and Egypt. They were heated by massive furnaces that burned continuously, consuming vast quantities of wood, warming the water in the hot rooms to temperatures that would seem almost unbearable, creating clouds of steam that filled the bathing chambers. But most Romans didn't bathe in these magnificent imperial establishments. They used smaller, more modest bathhouses scattered throughout the city, neighborhood facilities that charged a small entrance fee, affordable even to the poor, sometimes waived entirely for children or on special holidays when wealthy patrons might sponsor free bathing for the public as a gesture of generosity. These smaller baths lacked the marble and gold of the great thermae, but they served the same essential functions, provided the same basic services, allowed ordinary Romans access to the bathing culture that was such a central part of their civilization. The routine of bathing followed a pattern that would have been familiar to anyone in the city. You would arrive at the bathhouse in the afternoon, after the day's work was done or at least paused, bringing with you a small kit of bathing supplies. A flask of olive oil, because Romans didn't use soap as we would understand it. A strigil, a curved metal scraper used to remove the oil and the dirt it had loosened from your skin. Perhaps a towel, though the bathhouses often provided these for a small additional fee. A change of clothes, to put on after bathing, leaving your dirty garments to be cleaned or simply wearing them again if you couldn't afford the luxury of fresh clothing. The bathhouse would be crowded, noisy, filled with the sounds of voices echoing off tile and stone, the splash of water, the scrape of strigils against skin, the general hubbub of dozens or hundreds of people all engaged in the same activities in close proximity. There was no privacy in the Roman baths, no individual changing rooms or private bathing spaces. Everyone was together, naked or nearly so, rich and poor side by side, though even here some distinctions persisted. The wealthy might bring their own slaves to attend them, to rub oil into their skin, to wield the strigil, to carry their belongings. The poor did these tasks for themselves, or relied on the services of bathhouse attendants who worked for tips. You would begin in the changing room, the appetitorium, where you would remove your clothing and leave it in a niche or cubby, hoping that it would still be there when you returned, though theft was common enough that cautious bathers kept an eye on their belongings or paid an attendant to watch them. Then, naked, you might proceed to the exercise area, the palestra, an open courtyard or covered hall where bathers could engage in physical activity before bathing. Wrestling, ball games, lifting weights, whatever form of exercise appealed to you or seemed appropriate to work up a sweat before entering the actual bathing rooms. Exercise before bathing served a practical purpose. Romans believed that perspiration helped purge impurities from the body, that physical exertion was healthy and necessary, that bathing was most effective after you had worked your muscles and opened your pores with vigorous movement. So men would wrestle and play games, their naked bodies glistening with sweat and the dust from the exercise floor, building up an appetite for the cleansing that would follow. After exercise, you would begin the bathing sequence itself, moving through a series of rooms of different temperatures. The caldarium, the hot room, was often the first stop, a chamber heated to extraordinary temperatures by the hypercaust system beneath the floor and within the walls. Hot air from the furnaces would circulate through these hollow spaces, heating the room until it was almost unbearably warm, creating an environment similar to a modern sauna. You would sit or recline on stone benches, feeling the heat penetrate your body, the sweat pouring from your skin, your muscles relaxing in the warmth. Here, in the caldarium, you would apply olive oil to your skin, or have a slave or attendant apply it for you, rubbing it in thoroughly, coating your entire body. The oil would mix with the sweat, with the dirt and dead skin, creating a grimy layer that would then be scraped off with the strigil. The strigil was a simple tool, a curved blade of metal with a handle, and using it required technique. You would drag it across your skin, applying just enough pressure to remove the oil and dirt without cutting yourself, collecting the scrapings and discarding them into basins provided for that purpose. This method of cleaning seems strange to us, accustomed as we are to soap and water, but it was effective in its way. The oil loosened dirt, the scraping removed it, and the combination of heat and exertion and oil and scraping left the skin feeling clean, refreshed, glowing. Romans believed this was not just cleansing but healthy, that it promoted good circulation, that it kept the body in balance, that it was essential to well-being. From the caldarium, you might proceed to the tepidarium, a warm room, less intensely heated, where you could relax, adjust to the temperature change, perhaps linger in conversation with other bathers. And finally, the frigidarium, the cold room, with its pool of unheated water where you would plunge, the shock of cold after the heat, an invigorating experience that left you feeling alert and alive. Some baths had outdoor swimming pools as well, natatio, where you could swim or simply cool off further, enjoying the open air after the enclosed warmth of the bathing chambers. The experience of the baths was not just physical but social. This was where people came to see and be seen, to conduct the informal business that couldn't be handled in more formal settings, to gossip and exchange news and maintain the networks of relationship that were so important in Roman society. You might encounter a patron or a client, might discuss politics with an acquaintance, might overhear conversations about business opportunities or scandals or the latest news from the provinces. Some bathhouses had libraries, reading rooms where bathers could relax with scrolls or codices, could engage their minds while their bodies recuperated from the heat and exercise. There might be vendors selling food and drink, because bathing was hungry work, and Romans might spend hours at the baths, making an afternoon or evening of it, combining hygiene with entertainment and sociability in a way that made the baths central to urban life. But the baths, for all their attractions, also revealed some of the less appealing aspects of Roman attitudes toward hygiene and privacy. The public toilets, the latrinae, were often attached to bathhouses or located in other public spaces throughout the city, and they embodied a conception of privacy, or rather lack thereof, that would seem shocking by modern standards. These were communal facilities, long stone benches with holes cut at regular intervals, positioned over channels through which water would flow continuously, carrying waste away to the source. There were no partitions, no stalls, no attempt to provide privacy. Romans would sit side by side, conducting their business, chatting casually, completely unbothered by the lack of privacy, the public nature of this most private activity. And the method of cleaning after using the toilet was, if anything, even more startling. There was a sponge attached to a stick, the tessorium, which was soaked in a channel of running water or in a bucket of water mixed with vinegar or salt water. This sponge would be used to clean oneself, then rinsed in the water, and left for the next person to use. The same sponge, used by person after person after person, passed from hand to hand throughout the day. The water was changed periodically, the sponge presumably rinsed between uses, but still, the lack of hygiene by our standards is obvious, the potential for spreading disease clear. Romans seemed untroubled by this, accepted it as normal, as simply the way things were done. They had no concept of germs, no understanding of how diseases spread through contaminated materials and surfaces. They could see that sanitation mattered, that cities with good sewers and clean water were healthier than those without, but they couldn't see the invisible mechanisms of infection, couldn't understand why sharing a toilet sponge might be problematic. Similarly puzzling, from a modern perspective, was the Roman approach to laundry. Clean clothing mattered to Romans, particularly clean togas for those who wore them, and the process of cleaning textiles was the work of specialized craftsmen, the fullers, who operated workshops throughout the city. But the primary cleaning agent used by fullers was not soap but urine, human urine, collected in large jars placed on street corners, into which passers-by would urinate, providing the raw material for the fulling industry. Urine contains ammonia, which breaks down grease and dirt, making it an effective cleaning agent. The fullers would soak textiles in diluted urine, would tread on them with bare feet to work the urine into the fabric, would then rinse them thoroughly in clean water, would dry and bleach them in the sun, would brush and comb them to raise the nap. The process worked, producing clean, bright textiles, but it required working with enormous quantities of urine, and the smell from the fulleries was notorious, powerful enough to be offensive even to Romans accustomed to the general olfactory assault of urban life. That urine was valuable enough to be collected and sold, valuable enough that the Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on it, tells us something about Roman pragmatism, about a willingness to use whatever worked regardless of our modern squeamishness about bodily wastes. When Vespasian's son objected to the urine tax as undignified, the emperor is said to have held up a coin from the tax revenue and asked if it smelled bad. Pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, the phrase that justified taxing even the most humble and unpleasant of commodities. When Romans fell ill, when they suffered injuries or chronic conditions that limited their lives, they turned to medical practitioners whose understanding of the human body was a mixture of careful observation, inherited knowledge, philosophical theory, and practices that ranged from helpful to actively harmful. Roman medicine was not scientific in the modern sense. There were no controlled trials, no systematic testing of treatments, no real understanding of anatomy and physiology beyond what could be learned from treating wounds and observing symptoms. Physicians were often Greeks or trained in Greek medical traditions, because the Greeks had developed the most sophisticated medical knowledge in the ancient world. A Roman physician would likely have studied the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, would have learned theories about the four humours, blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, whose balance or imbalance was believed to determine health and illness. Treatment would aim to restore balance, to correct excess or deficiency of particular humours through diet, drugs, or physical interventions. Herbal remedies were widely used, and some of these had genuine therapeutic value. Willow bark for pain, which contains a compound related to aspirin. Opium for severe pain and to induce sleep. Various plants for digestive complaints, for fevers, for skin conditions. Roman physicians accumulated practical knowledge about what worked, even if they didn't understand why it worked, and some of their herbal remedies were genuinely helpful. But other treatments were useless or harmful. Bloodletting, the deliberate removal of blood from the patient, was believed to reduce excess of the blood humor, to bring the body back into balance. It was used for fevers, for inflammations, for headaches, for countless conditions where removing blood from an already sick person did nothing to help and quite possibly made things worse through blood loss and the introduction of infection through unsterilized instruments. Superstition mingled freely with more rational approaches. Amulets might be worn to ward off disease. Prayers might be offered to Asclepius, the god of healing, or to other deities believed to have power over illness and health. Patients might sleep in temples, hoping for healing dreams that would reveal treatments or even cure them directly through divine intervention. The line between medicine and magic was blurry, and physicians might employ both practical remedies and supernatural appeals, hedging their bets, using every tool available in their struggle against disease and injury. Surgery was practiced, particularly for wounds and injuries, for removing arrows and treating broken bones and dealing with the consequences of violence that was all too common in a militarized society. Roman military surgeons developed considerable skill in treating battlefield injuries, and this knowledge was available in the city as well. But surgery without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium, without understanding of antiseptic technique, without antibiotics to prevent infection, was a desperate measure, undertaken only when absolutely necessary, with outcomes that were uncertain at best. And so Romans lived with illness and pain and disability as inevitable parts of existence, as misfortunes that might strike anyone, that could be managed perhaps but rarely cured, that reminded everyone of human fragility, of the limits of knowledge and control. They sought relief in the baths, in herbal remedies, in prayers and amulets, in the ministrations of physicians whose confidence often exceeded their ability to help. They endured, adapted, made the best of situations they couldn't fully understand or control, much as they endured the unsanitary conditions of the streets, the shared toilet sponges, the smell of the fooleries. This was Roman hygiene, Roman health, Roman medicine, a mixture of the sophisticated and the primitive, of practices that promoted well-being and practices that seem horrifying by modern standards. But it was their normal, their daily experience, the framework within which they maintained their bodies, sought cleanliness, pursued health, and confronted the diseases and injuries that were their constant companions in a world without modern medicine's tools and knowledge. In a society as conscious of hierarchy as Rome, where your position in the social order determined almost every aspect of your life, appearance mattered enormously. How you dressed, how you presented yourself, the care you took with your grooming, all of this communicated information about who you were, about your status and wealth, about whether you were citizen or foreigner, free or enslaved, respectable or disreputable. Romans were skilled readers of these visual codes, could assess a stranger's position at a glance, could tell from across a crowded forum whether someone was worth cultivating as a connection or could be safely ignored. The foundation of Roman dress, the basic garment worn by almost everyone regardless of status, was the tunic. This was a simple piece of clothing, essentially a large rectangle of fabric with an opening for the head and openings for the arms, sometimes sewn at the sides to create a more fitted shape, sometimes left loose and belted at the waist. Tunics were typically made of wool, though linen was used in hot weather by those who could afford it, and the very wealthy might wear tunics of silk, that exotic fabric imported at enormous expense from distant lands far to the east. For most Romans, the tunic was their only garment, or at least their primary one, worn day in and day out, through work and leisure and sleep. A laborious tunic would be short, ending above the knee, allowing freedom of movement, practical for physical work. It would be undyed or dyed in dull, cheap colors, brown or gray or muddy yellow, colors that wouldn't show dirt, that didn't require expensive dyes. The fabric would be coarse, sturdy, able to withstand the wear and tear of hard use. Women also wore tunics as their basic undergarment, though respectable women would not appear in public wearing only a tunic. Over it, a married woman would wear the stola, a long garment that reached to her feet, often with short sleeves, sometimes elaborately pleated or gathered. The stola was the mark of a married woman, the female equivalent of the toga, identifying the wearer as a respectable matron rather than an unmarried girl or a woman of questionable reputation. Over the stola, women would often wear the palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped in various ways, pulled over the head for modesty or arranged artfully over the shoulders. The fabrics and colors of women's clothing varied enormously with wealth and status. A poor woman might wear a simple undyed stola of coarse wool, indistinguishable from the tunics worn by her family members except for its length. A wealthy woman might wear a stola of fine wool or linen, dyed in expensive colors, purple or deep red or vibrant yellow, decorated with embroidery or woven patterns, accessorized with jewelry that proclaimed her family's wealth and her husband's success. But it was the toga, that distinctive garment worn only by male Roman citizens, that most clearly embodied the connection between clothing and status, between appearance and identity. The toga was not just clothing. It was a symbol of citizenship, of Romanness itself, the garment that distinguished Romans from the subject peoples of the empire, that marked free men from slaves, that proclaimed to the world that the wearer was a member of the most privileged group in the most powerful state on earth. The toga was an enormous semicircular piece of white woolen fabric, measuring perhaps 15 to 20 feet along its curved edge, designed to be draped around the body in an elaborate arrangement that required skill and practice to achieve correctly. No one could put on a toga by themselves. It required assistance, usually from a slave trained in the proper technique, who would arrange the folds precisely, draping the fabric over the left shoulder, wrapping it around the back and under the right arm, then back over the left shoulder again, creating the distinctive layered look with the hanging fold, the sinus, that characterized a properly worn toga. Once arranged, the toga was cumbersome and restrictive. You couldn't move freely in a toga, couldn't run or engage in physical labor or do much of anything except walk slowly and carefully, one arm occupied with holding the folds in place, constantly aware of the fabric threatening to slip and come undone. This impracticality was precisely the point. The toga announced that you were a man who didn't need to work with his hands, who had the leisure and the slaves to maintain this elaborate costume, who participated in the civic life of Rome where togas were required rather than in the world of manual labor where they would be impossibly awkward. Most ordinary citizens owned a toga, because you needed one for certain occasions, for appearing before magistrates, for participating in religious festivals, for fulfilling civic duties. But few wore togas regularly. The common plebeian would wear his tunic for daily life, would don his toga only when circumstances required it, would be relieved to take it off again and return to the comfort and freedom of simpler dress. The toga was a burden, a symbol of citizenship that also symbolized the weight of civic obligation, the demands that Roman identity placed upon its bearers. But for the elite, for senators and magistrates and wealthy men whose lives were spent in public service and political competition, the toga was daily wear, and even among togas there were distinctions that marked rank and office. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe, the toga praetexta, the purple dye expensive and restricted, immediately identifying the wearer as a member of Rome's highest legislative body. Magistrates and priests wore similar purple-striped togas. Boys from aristocratic families wore the toga praetexta until they came of age, at which point they would assume the plain white toga virilis, the toga of manhood. Candidates for political office wore togas specially whitened with chalk, the toga candida, from which we get the word candidate, the gleaming white fabric making them highly visible in crowds, marking them as seekers of public favor. And triumphant generals, celebrating military victories in the elaborate triumph processions that were Rome's highest honor, wore togas dyed entirely purple, the toga picta, along with other elaborate regalia that temporarily elevated them almost to the status of gods. Purple dye itself was a marker of wealth and status. True purple, Tyrian purple, was made from sea snails harvested along the coast of Phoenicia, and the process of creating the dye was so labor-intensive that purple fabric was astonishingly expensive, affordable only to the very wealthy, restricted by law to certain uses. The depth of purple in someone's clothing, the amount of purple-dyed fabric they wore, communicated their position in society as clearly as words could. Women's appearance was equally subject to codes and expectations, though the markers were different. A respectable woman's dress should be modest, should cover her body appropriately, should signal her status as a married woman if she was one. But within these constraints, there was room for display, for the use of clothing and jewelry and cosmetics to demonstrate wealth and taste, to compete with other women for social position, to signal the prosperity and generosity of husbands and fathers. Jewelry was particularly important as a marker of status. A wealthy woman might wear gold necklaces, bracelets stacked on her arms, rings on multiple fingers, earrings of gold set with precious stones. The quantity and quality of jewelry proclaimed her family's wealth, served as a kind of portable treasury, a store of value that could be worn and displayed. A poor woman might wear simple bronze jewelry or none at all, the absence of adornment marking her limited resources as clearly as the presence of gold marked the resources of the wealthy. Hairstyles, too, conveyed information about status and resources. A wealthy woman would have slaves to dress her hair, could afford the time and expense of elaborate arrangements, styles that required heating irons to create curls, pins and combs to secure complex structures, oils and pomades to make hair shine and hold its shape. The fashions changed over time, and aristocratic women would adopt the latest styles, would compete to have the most elaborate and fashionable hair, would employ the most skilled ornatresses, the slave women who specialized in hairdressing. For men, too, grooming mattered, though the standards were different. In the late Republic and early Empire, most men were clean-shaven, would visit barbers regularly to maintain their appearance. The barber's shop was another social space, like the baths, where men would gather, where gossip would be exchanged, where you might spend considerable time waiting your turn and then sitting while the barber worked with his razor, scraping away stubble, trimming hair, sometimes providing other services like tooth extraction or minor medical procedures. Beards went in and out of fashion. The Emperor Hadrian famously wore a beard, breaking with the clean-shaven tradition of earlier emperors, and after him beards became more common among the elite, imitating the imperial style. But whatever the fashion, care of facial hair and head hair was expected, was part of presenting oneself as a civilized Roman rather than a barbarian, as someone who respected social norms rather than someone careless of appearance. Cosmetics and perfumes were widely used, by women certainly but also by men, particularly wealthy men who could afford expensive imported scents. This wasn't simply vanity, though vanity certainly played a role. It was also necessity, a response to the olfactory challenges of urban life in a city without modern sanitation, where the streets smelled of garbage and human waste, where personal hygiene was maintained through oil and scraping rather than soap and water, where bodies that worked hard in the heat produced odors that Romans found as unpleasant as we would. Perfumes could be made from various sources, from flowers and herbs and spices, mixed with oils to create scents that could be applied to skin or clothing or hair. The wealthy might use perfumes made from exotic ingredients imported from distant provinces, frankincense from Arabia, balsam from Judea, nard from India. These scents were expensive, luxurious, another marker of wealth and status, another way to distinguish yourself from the common crowd who couldn't afford to smell of anything but sweat and the streets. Women used cosmetics extensively, at least among the upper classes where appearance was a form of competition and display. White lead to lighten the complexion, because pale skin was associated with wealth and leisure, with not having to work outdoors, with not being subjected to the darkening effects of the sun. Rouge to add color to cheeks and lips. Kohl to darken eyelashes and eyebrows. These cosmetics were applied with care, the goal being to enhance natural beauty according to the standards of the time, to present an idealized version of oneself. The ingredients used in cosmetics were sometimes dangerous. White lead is toxic, and prolonged use could cause serious health problems, but Roman women didn't know this, couldn't connect their cosmetic choices to the symptoms that might develop years later. They used what was available, what tradition said was effective, what fashion dictated, just as they made all their choices within the limits of their knowledge and their circumstances. For slaves, appearance was dictated entirely by their masters. A household slave might be given decent clothing, because a shabby slave reflected poorly on the master's household, suggested either poverty or lack of care that would damage the master's reputation. Slaves in wealthy households might be dressed quite well, particularly those who served as attendants, and there were slaves whose bodies were adorned not with fine clothing but with marks of their status. Brands or tattoos identifying them as slaves, marks that could never be fully erased even if they achieved freedom, permanent signs of their degraded status. Runaway slaves, if recaptured, might be marked on their foreheads with letters indicating their crime, a permanent warning to others and a humiliation that followed them for the rest of their lives. Appearance in Rome was never neutral, never simply a matter of personal preference or comfort. Every choice about clothing, every decision about grooming, every detail of how you presented yourself was read by others, was interpreted according to the social codes that everyone understood, that everyone had internalized from childhood. To dress inappropriately for your status was to invite ridicule or censure. A poor man wearing purple would be laughed at or possibly accused of theft. A woman appearing in public dressed immodestly might be assumed to be a prostitute, regardless of her actual status or intentions. And so Romans dressed carefully, attended to their appearance, used clothing and cosmetics and jewelry to navigate the complex social world in which they lived. They read the appearances of others with practiced eyes, made quick judgments about who was worth their attention, who could be ignored, who might be useful, who was dangerous. In a world without photographs or identity documents, where you might encounter thousands of strangers every day, these visual codes were essential, were the language through which social position was communicated and acknowledged. As the afternoon wore on, as people emerged from the baths clean and refreshed, as they dressed themselves or were dressed by slaves in the clothing appropriate to their status and their evening plans, they carried with them all the meanings that their appearance conveyed, all the information coded in fabric and color and cut and accessory, all the signals that would be read and understood by every Roman who saw them. As the workday drew to a close, as the 6 hours of labor from sunrise to midday and perhaps a bit beyond came to an end, Romans found themselves with something that modern life sometimes denies us: time. Time that belonged to them rather than to their employers or their obligations, time that could be devoted to rest, to pleasure, to the pursuit of activities that served no practical purpose beyond enjoyment and the maintenance of social bonds. This division of the day, with work concentrated in the morning and early afternoon and leisure occupying the later hours, was fundamental to Roman life. The Romans believed that a life devoted entirely to work, with no time for relaxation and social engagement, was barely a life at all. It was the mark of a slave, someone who had no control over their time, whose every hour belonged to their master. A free man, even a poor one, had the right to leisure, to otium, that untranslated Latin word that means something more than mere idleness, that carries connotations of civilized relaxation, of time spent in worthy pursuits, of the freedom to choose how to spend your hours. For many Romans, particularly those who had spent the morning in physical labor, the afternoon meant rest in the most literal sense. Simply sitting, recovering from the exertion of work, letting tired muscles relax, perhaps dozing in the shade if shade could be found, or in the relative coolness of their apartments if the heat outside had become oppressive. This was not lazy indulgence but necessary recovery, the body's need for rest after hours of physical demands, and no shame attached to it. But for those with energy remaining, for those whose work had not been physically exhausting, or for those who had recovered sufficiently after a midday meal and perhaps a brief rest, the afternoon offered opportunities for more active forms of leisure. And chief among these were games, contests of skill and chance that Romans pursued with an enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on obsession. Board games were enormously popular across all classes of Roman society. The wealthy might play on elaborate boards of fine wood inlaid with ivory, using playing pieces of precious materials. The poor played on boards scratched into stone or drawn in the dirt, using pebbles or broken pottery as pieces. But rich and poor alike understood the rules, enjoyed the competition, the strategy, the social interaction that games provided. One of the most popular games was called Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum, the game of 12 lines, an ancestor of modern backgammon. It was played on a board divided into sections, with pieces moved according to the throw of dice, combining luck and strategy in a way that made it endlessly engaging. Players would sit for hours, moving their pieces, calculating odds, trying to outmaneuver their opponents, sometimes playing for small stakes, sometimes simply for the pleasure of the game itself. Another popular game was La Trunculi, a strategy game somewhat similar to chess or checkers, played on a grid with pieces that could capture opponents' pieces according to specific rules. This was a game of pure strategy, with no element of chance, and skilled players were admired for their tactical thinking, their ability to plan several moves ahead, to set traps and avoid their opponents' attempts to capture their pieces. These games were played everywhere. In the forums and public spaces, where boards were sometimes permanently carved into stone benches or pavements, where anyone passing by might stop to watch a match or challenge the winner to a game. In the baths, where the warm rooms and social atmosphere made them perfect settings for leisurely games between bathing sessions. In taverns and private homes, wherever people gathered and had time to spend in each other's company. Ball games, too, were popular, both as casual recreation and as exercise. Romans played various ball games, some involving throwing and catching, others involving striking a ball with the hand or a curved stick, games that required physical skill and coordination. These might be played in the open spaces attached to bath complexes, in the Campus Martius, the great open field on the edge of the city that served as Rome's primary recreation ground, or in the streets themselves, children and adults alike joining in informal games that would continue until darkness made play impossible. But perhaps no form of gaming was as pervasive, as compulsive, as gambling with dice. Romans loved to gamble. They bet on everything, on dice games, on board games, on athletic competitions, on gladiatorial contests and chariot races, on anything that offered the possibility of winning money or goods through luck or skill or both. The appeal was universal, cutting across all social classes. Senators might lose fortunes on a single throw of the dice. Poor men might wager their last few coins, hoping for a win that would solve their immediate problems, more often experiencing a loss that made those problems worse. Dice games were simple. 3 dice would be thrown, and the sum or the combination would determine the winner. Or knucklebones, the ankle bones of sheep or goats, would be tossed, the way they landed determining the outcome. The games required no equipment beyond the dice or bones themselves, could be played anywhere, needed only 2 or more players willing to stake something on the outcome. The government disapproved of gambling, at least officially. Laws restricted gambling to certain times and places, theoretically limiting it to the festival of Saturnalia in December, when normal social rules were relaxed and gambling was permitted. But in practice, these laws were largely ignored. Romans gambled constantly, openly, in the streets and taverns and baths, and the authorities generally turned a blind eye unless the gambling led to violence or disorder that demanded intervention. the attraction of gambling was not just the possibility of winning, though that was certainly part of it. It was also the excitement, the rush of anticipation as the dice were thrown, the camaraderie of players gathered around a game, the stories of spectacular wins and devastating losses that circulated through the city, becoming part of the urban folklore. Gambling was a social activity, a way to pass time with companions, to test your luck against fate, to feel the thrill of risk in a life that for most Romans offered little opportunity for excitement beyond the daily struggle for survival. For many working-class Romans, for freedmen and poor plebeians and off-duty slaves whose masters allowed them some free time, the tavern was the center of afternoon and evening social life. These were not the refined establishments where the wealthy might dine, but rough, basic spaces, often just single rooms, with a counter for serving and a few tables or benches, places where wine was cheap and the clientele was not discriminating about quality or atmosphere. The wine served in taverns was of the poorest quality, harsh and sour even when diluted with water, sometimes adulterated with additives to improve flavor or simply to stretch the supply. But it was alcoholic, it was cheap, and it provided a release from the tensions and difficulties of daily life. Men would gather in taverns after work, would drink and talk and sometimes eat simple food, bowls of beans or porridge or whatever the tavern keeper had available. These were masculine spaces, primarily. Respectable women would not be found in taverns, would not be seen drinking in public establishments. The women present in taverns were usually serving girls, slaves, or freedwomen working for the tavern keeper, or prostitutes looking for customers, women whose presence confirmed the disreputable nature of these establishments in the eyes of the respectable classes. But for those who frequented them, taverns provided something important, a space that was neither work nor home, where the hierarchies and obligations that governed the rest of life could be temporarily set aside, where a poor laborer could sit and drink and talk with his fellows without worrying about deference to patrons or masters, where friendships could be maintained, where grievances could be aired, where the community of the working poor could gather and reinforce its bonds. The conversation in taverns ranged across every topic. Complaints about work, about wages, about difficult masters or demanding customers. Gossip about neighbors, about scandals and affairs and family troubles. Politics, discussed with varying degrees of understanding, opinions offered freely about the emperor and the senate and the state of the empire. Sports, particularly the chariot races, with fierce loyalty to the different racing factions, the blues and the greens and the reds and the whites, arguments about drivers and horses and past races that could go on for hours. Sometimes the conversation would turn bitter, fueled by wine and frustration, complaints about the unfairness of Roman society, about the wealth of the elite while so many struggled to survive, about the arrogance of the powerful and the indignities suffered by the poor. Sometimes fights would break out, arguments escalating to violence, wine cups thrown, fists swung, the tavern keeper trying to restore order before the disturbance attracted the attention of authorities who might shut down the establishment. But more often, the taverns were simply places to be, to spend time in company, to feel part of a community however marginal, to find brief escape from the loneliness and difficulty that poverty could impose. For men who lived in cramped, uncomfortable apartments, who worked long hours at demanding labor, who had little to look forward to beyond more of the same, the tavern offered a kind of refuge, a space that was theirs, at least for the hours they could afford to spend there. The baths, as we have seen, served some of the same functions, providing space for social interaction, for conversation and connection. But the baths were more respectable, more acceptable across the social spectrum, places where the wealthy and the poor might mingle, where family men and young boys and even occasionally women in separate facilities or at separate hours could gather. The baths were civic institutions, part of the infrastructure of Roman life, symbols of civilization and refinement. After bathing, after the process of cleaning and scraping and soaking in the various temperature pools, Romans might linger in the bath complex, taking advantage of the other amenities it offered. Some bath complexes had libraries, collections of scrolls and later codices that bathers could read, could consult for information or entertainment. These were not lending libraries in the modern sense. You couldn't take books home. But you could sit in the reading room, could unroll a scroll and spend an hour or two absorbed in literature or history or philosophy, could improve your mind while your body recovered from the heat and exercise of bathing. Others might gather in conversation areas, might discuss business or politics or philosophy, might cultivate relationships with potential patrons or clients, might simply enjoy intelligent discussion with educated companions. The baths provided settings for both relaxation and the subtle work of social networking, where friendships could be deepened, where useful connections could be made, where a young man hoping to advance in the world might attract the notice of someone in a position to help him. For those less intellectually inclined, there was always the simple pleasure of sitting, of doing nothing in particular, of letting the time pass without purpose or goal, enjoying the warmth, the cleanliness, the sense of physical well-being that came from proper bathing, from time spent in spaces designed for human comfort and pleasure rather than for work and productivity. Children, when they had leisure time, played in the streets and open spaces, their games simple but absorbing. They played with balls and hoops, with toys carved from wood or fashioned from scraps of cloth and string. They played games of tag and hide and seek, games whose rules have remained largely unchanged across millennia and cultures. They explored their neighborhoods, formed friendships and rivalries, got into minor troubles that occasionally required adult intervention. For children of wealthy families, there might be more elaborate toys, dolls with movable limbs, miniature carts pulled by small animals, playhouses, and toy weapons. But rich and poor alike knew how to play, how to create entertainment from whatever was available, how to fill their hours with the imaginative games that children have always played, the pretending and exploring and testing that is the work of childhood disguised as leisure. As the afternoon lengthened toward evening, as the light began to soften and the heat of the day finally started to ease, the city would slowly transition toward the rhythms of night. But these afternoon hours, these hours of leisure and play and social engagement, were essential to Roman life, were what made the hard work of the morning bearable, what gave Romans something to look forward to beyond mere survival. The games and conversations, the drinking and bathing and reading, the time spent in the company of friends and companions, this was what it meant to live, not just to exist. This was the reward for labor, the compensation for the difficulties and indignities that life imposed. This was the space where Romans could be fully themselves, where they could pursue pleasure and friendship and connection, where they could experience the joy and satisfaction that made life worth living, even in circumstances that we might find intolerable. And as they played their games and drank their wine and sat in the warm waters of the baths, Romans knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more obligations, more challenges to be faced. But for now, for these precious afternoon hours, they were free, and they used that freedom as humans always have, seeking pleasure, seeking connection, seeking brief escape from the grinding demands of survival in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Rome was a city that loved spectacle, that craved entertainment on a scale that would dwarf anything available in smaller cities or towns, that demanded to be dazzled and thrilled and shocked by displays of skill and violence and drama. This appetite for public entertainment was not incidental to Roman life but central to it, woven into the fabric of the city's politics and society, a tool of social control as much as a source of pleasure, a way for the powerful to maintain their hold on the masses and for the masses to experience, however briefly, a sense of participation in something larger than their individual struggles. The phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, coined by the satirist Juvenal, captured this dynamic perfectly. Give the people food, through the grain dole, and give them entertainment, through public spectacles, and they will remain docile, will not rise up against the inequalities and injustices that define their existence, will be satisfied with these basic provisions and not demand real political power or social change. This was cynical but not entirely wrong. Public entertainment in Rome served multiple functions, providing genuine pleasure and excitement while simultaneously functioning as a mechanism of social control, a pressure valve that released tensions that might otherwise have exploded into violence or rebellion. The greatest of all Roman spectacles, the entertainment that drew the largest crowds and inspired the most passionate devotion, was chariot racing. The Circus Maximus, the enormous stadium that stretched along the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, could accommodate somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators, a substantial portion of Rome's entire population, all gathered to watch teams of horses and drivers compete in races that were thrilling, dangerous, and deeply meaningful to those who watched them. The races themselves were relatively simple in concept. Four-horse chariots, quadrigi, would race around an oval track, completing 7 laps, the drivers standing in their light, fragile vehicles, controlling their teams with remarkable skill, navigating the tight turns at each end of the track where collisions were frequent and devastating. The dust, the noise, the speed, the constant threat of disaster as chariots jostled for position, wheels interlocking, drivers losing control, horses stumbling and bringing down entire teams in spectacular crashes, all of this combined to create a spectacle that was genuinely exciting, that held the attention of crowds for hours as race followed race throughout the day. But chariot racing was about much more than the races themselves. The sport was organized around 4 factions, the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites, each faction maintaining stables of horses, employing drivers, competing not just in individual races but in an ongoing rivalry that gave structure to the sport and inspired loyalty that bordered on fanaticism. Fans would identify passionately with their chosen faction, would wear its colors, would riot in the streets if they felt their team had been cheated, would celebrate victories and mourn defeats with an intensity that seems extraordinary for what was, after all, just a sporting event. These factional loyalties cut across social classes. A senator and a beggar might both support the Blues, might sit in the Circus Maximus, separated by the seating arrangements that reflected their different social positions but united in their hope for a blue victory, their despair when blue chariots crashed, their joy when blue drivers crossed the finish line first. This shared passion created a kind of community, a sense of common identity that briefly transcended the rigid hierarchies that otherwise divided Romans. The successful chariot drivers became celebrities, famous throughout the city, recognized wherever they went, earning enormous sums of money, at least the most skilled and fortunate among them. These were often slaves or freedmen, men from the lowest ranks of society who had risen through extraordinary skill and courage to positions of fame and wealth that most freeborn Romans could never achieve. A famous charioteer like Gaius Appuleius Diocles, whose career earnings were carefully recorded, accumulated wealth that would rival that of senators, though he could never achieve their social status, could never fully escape the taint of his origins and his profession. The races were free to attend, sponsored by magistrates or by the emperor himself, part of the public generosity that wealthy Romans were expected to display, the provision of entertainment to the masses that was both a duty and an opportunity to curry favor, to build popularity, to demonstrate the resources and magnificence that might translate into political power or simply into enhanced prestige. If chariot racing was Rome's most popular spectacle, gladiatorial games were its most notorious, the entertainment that has captured the modern imagination more than any other aspect of Roman culture, that has come to symbolize both the grandeur and the brutality of Roman civilization. These games, Munera Gladiatoria, were displays of armed combat, men fighting each other or wild animals, sometimes to the death, before crowds that could number in the tens of thousands in the great amphitheaters, smaller but still substantial crowds in the wooden amphitheaters that were erected temporarily in various parts of the city. The fighters, the gladiators, were mostly slaves or condemned criminals, forced into this brutal profession, though some were volunteers, free men who chose to become gladiators for the fame and the money that successful fighters could earn. They trained in special schools, the ludi, learning the techniques of their particular fighting style, each type of gladiator with distinctive armor and weapons. The Mamillo with his fish-crested helmet and large shield. The Retiarius with his net and trident, lightly armed, relying on speed and skill. The Thrax with his small shield and curved sword. Matches were often arranged between contrasting types, the different fighting styles creating varied tactical situations that kept the contests interesting. A gladiatorial show might last all day, beginning with animal hunts in the morning, venations, where trained hunters would face lions or bears or other dangerous beasts imported at enormous expense from Africa and other distant regions. The crowd would thrill to see human courage pitted against animal ferocity, would cheer when a particularly dangerous beast was killed, would express their appreciation for impressive displays of skill or bravery. At midday might come the executions, the noxii, condemned criminals killed in various ways for the entertainment of the crowd. These were not combat but simply killing, sometimes by crucifixion or burning, sometimes by being thrown to wild animals, sometimes by being forced to fight each other without training or proper weapons, their deaths certain, only the manner and timing in question. This was punishment transformed into spectacle, justice enacted publicly, the power of the state to kill those who violated its laws demonstrated before thousands of witnesses. The afternoon would bring the main event, the gladiatorial combats themselves, the skilled fighters for whom the crowd had really come. These matches were not always to the death. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain, and killing them casually would have been wasteful. Many fights would end when one fighter was clearly beaten, would raise his finger in submission, would appeal to the crowd and to the sponsor of the games for mercy. Sometimes mercy would be granted, the defeated fighter allowed to live, to fight another day. Sometimes the crowd would demand death, would turn their thumbs down, would insist that the victor finish his opponent, and the sponsor, reading the mood, would signal for the killing blow. Successful gladiators could become famous, could win their freedom, could even become wealthy if they survived long enough and won consistently enough. But most gladiators lived short, brutal lives, dying young in the arena or from wounds sustained in combat, their bodies broken by the violence of their profession. They were simultaneously admired and despised, celebrated for their courage and skill while being looked down upon for the degrading nature of their work, for the fact that they shed blood for entertainment, that they were in some sense prostitutes of violence, selling their bodies and their lives for the pleasure of the crowd. The amphitheater was a space where Romans could experience emotions that daily life rarely permitted. The excitement of danger witnessed from safety. The thrill of violence that you were not personally at risk from. The satisfaction of seeing justice enacted through the deaths of criminals. The appreciation of skill and courage displayed under the most extreme circumstances. And underlying all of this, the reminder of mortality, the knowledge that life was fragile, that death could come suddenly and violently, that the line between living and dying was thin and easily crossed. But not all Roman entertainment involved blood and death. The theaters offered different pleasures, performances of plays and mimes and pantomimes that ranged from high culture to broad farce, from careful revivals of classical Greek tragedies to bawdy comedies that would make audiences roar with laughter at sexual innuendo and slapstick humor. The theaters were permanent structures, some of enormous size, their semicircular seating rising in tiers, providing views of the stage to thousands of spectators. The performances were free, like the games and races, sponsored by wealthy benefactors or by the state, available to anyone who could find a seat, though as always, seating was arranged by social class, the best seats reserved for senators and equestrians, the common people relegated to the upper tiers. Tragedies, when they were performed, tended to be revivals of classical works, plays by Greek masters or their Roman imitators, stories of gods and heroes, of fate and suffering and moral consequence. These were not everyday entertainment but special occasions, performances that appealed to the educated elite, that demonstrated cultural refinement and connection to the Greek tradition that Romans both admired and felt superior to. Comedies were more popular, more frequently performed, more accessible to ordinary Romans. The plays of Plautus and Terence, with their stock characters and mistaken identities and clever slaves outwitting their masters, provided humor that didn't require extensive education to appreciate. The situations were familiar, the jokes broad, the outcomes predictable but satisfying. Young lovers kept apart by circumstances would find their way together. Misers would be taught lessons. Boastful soldiers would be revealed as cowards. The natural order would be temporarily inverted, slaves would show themselves cleverer than their masters, but by the end, social hierarchies would be reaffirmed, everyone would end up in their proper place, and the audience could enjoy the temporary subversion while being reassured that the fundamental structures of their society remained intact. Mime and pantomime were even more popular, performances that relied less on spoken dialogue and more on physical comedy, on elaborate gestures and costumes and masks, on music and dance. These shows could be crude, sexually explicit, filled with content that respectable people would claim to disapprove of while actually enjoying immensely. Women performed in mimes, which was scandalous but also part of the appeal, the transgression of seeing women on stage, often scantily clad, participating in performances that were sexually suggestive or outright obscene. The content of these performances could be politically charged, could include satire of current events or public figures, though there were limits to how far performers could go, particularly when it came to mocking the emperor or his family. But within those limits, the theatre provided a space for social commentary, for expressing criticisms that might be dangerous to voice in other contexts, for laughing at the powerful and the pretentious and the hypocritical. All of these spectacles, the races and the games and the theatrical performances, served the same underlying functions. They provided entertainment, certainly, genuine pleasure and excitement for people whose lives offered little of either. They reinforced social bonds, creating shared experiences, giving people something to talk about, something to look forward to, markers around which the calendar year was organized. They demonstrated the generosity and power of the elite, who sponsored these events, who provided bread and circuses to the masses, who used their wealth to gain popularity and influence. And they served as tools of social control, channeling the energies and frustrations of the urban poor into relatively harmless outlets, into passionate support for racing factions or favorite gladiators, into the vicarious experience of violence and risk and triumph, into laughter at theatrical performances. As long as the people had their entertainment, as long as they could gather in enormous crowds to watch spectacles that awed and thrilled them, they were less likely to focus on the inequalities and injustices of their society, less likely to organize politically, less likely to threaten the power structures that kept them in subordinate positions. This was understood by everyone, by the emperors and senators who sponsored the games and by the crowds who attended them. The bargain was implicit but clear. The elite would provide entertainment and subsidized grain. The masses would accept their subordinate position and not threaten the social order. And for centuries, this arrangement worked, held together a society of extraordinary inequality through a combination of genuine benefit and cynical manipulation, of real pleasure and calculated distraction. As evening approached, as the races concluded and the gladiatorial matches ended and the theatrical performances drew to their close, Romans would stream out of the circus and amphitheater and theater, would flood into the streets, their heads full of what they had witnessed, their voices loud with discussion and argument about what they had seen, their bodies energized by hours of watching others perform feats of skill or endure violence or create laughter. They would carry these experiences home with them, would replay the most exciting moments in their minds, would tell stories to those who hadn't been able to attend, would relive the thrills and shocks and delights of the spectacle. And tomorrow or next week or next month, there would be more games, more races, more performances, the endless cycle of public entertainment that was as much a part of Roman life as work or family or the daily struggle for survival. As the sun descended toward the horizon, as the long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the city, Romans turned their attention to the most important meal of the day, the cena, the dinner that would provide the primary nourishment and, for many, the primary social engagement of the entire day. This was not the hurried breakfast of bread dipped in wine, not the simple midday meal grabbed from a street vendor or eaten quickly at home. The cena was a proper meal, a time to sit, to eat substantial food, to gather with family or friends, to mark the transition from the active hours of daylight to the quieter hours of evening and night. For the poor, for those who lived in the upper stories of the insulae, who had no kitchens and limited means, the cena might not be much more elaborate than their earlier meals. Perhaps some bread, better bread than breakfast if they'd been able to purchase it fresh in the afternoon. Perhaps some cheese or olives, some vegetables if they could afford them. Perhaps a bowl of bean stew or lentil porridge, purchased hot from a thermopolium, eaten while still warm, the heat and substance of it satisfying in a way that the sparse breakfast and midday snack had not been. These meals would be eaten simply, sitting on stools or benches in their cramped apartments, the family gathered together in the limited space available, sharing what food there was, the portions carefully divided to ensure that everyone received enough to quiet their hunger, if not to satisfy it completely. There would be conversation, the events of the day discussed, news shared, children told to behave themselves, the ordinary domestic interactions of families trying to maintain bonds despite the pressures of poverty and overcrowding. For families of moderate means, for successful artisans or shopkeepers, for freedmen who had built profitable businesses, the cena could be more substantial. There might be meat, not every day perhaps, but several times a week, pork or chicken or fish, grilled or stewed, flavored with herbs and garum, the fermented fish sauce that appeared in almost every Roman dish. There would be vegetables, whatever was in season, prepared simply, boiled or roasted, dressed with oil and vinegar. There would be bread, of course, better quality bread than the coarse loaves eaten by the poor, and wine, diluted with water as always, but decent wine, not the harsh stuff sold in the cheapest taverns. These families might eat in a proper dining room, if they lived in a domus or in a ground floor apartment large enough to have separate spaces for different functions. They would sit at a table, the family together, the meal a daily ritual that reinforced their bonds, that marked their modest prosperity, their distance from the desperate poverty of those above them in the insulae, their aspiration to someday rise further, to achieve the comfort and security that wealth could provide. But it was among the wealthy, among the senators and equestrians and successful merchants whose fortunes allowed them to live lives of refinement and display, that the cena reached its full expression as a social and gastronomic ritual. For these Romans, dinner was not just a meal but an opportunity for entertainment, for demonstrating wealth and taste, for maintaining the social networks that were essential to success in Roman society. The wealthy dined reclining on couches arranged around three sides of a square, the triclinium, the dining room that was one of the most important spaces in any domus. 3 couches, each accommodating 3 diners, 9 people in total for a proper dinner party, though the number could vary. The diners would recline on their left sides, propped up on cushions, their right hands free to reach for food from the tables placed before them, the posture both comfortable and symbolic, a mark of leisure and civilization, of having risen above the necessity of eating quickly while hunched over a bowl. The meal itself might consist of multiple courses, the exact number depending on the host's wealth and the formality of the occasion. It might begin with the gestatio, appetizers, small dishes intended to stimulate the appetite, to prepare the palate for what would follow. There might be eggs, a traditional beginning to Roman meals, or salads of lettuce and vegetables, or shellfish, oysters, or mussels, delicacies that proclaimed the host's ability to afford foods brought from the coast at considerable expense. Then would come the main courses, the prima mensa, the real substance of the meal. There might be multiple meat dishes, pork prepared in various ways, chicken, game birds if the host had access to them, fish if he lived near the coast or could afford to have it brought fresh from Ostia. Each dish would be elaborately prepared, flavored with complex sauces, the recipes drawn from cookbooks like that of Apicius, which detailed the sophisticated cuisine that wealthy Romans aspired to serve. The flavors would seem strange to modern palates. Romans loved strong tastes, combining sweet and savory in ways we might find unusual, adding honey to meat dishes, using garum in quantities that would overwhelm most contemporary diners, flavoring everything with herbs and spices, seeking intensity and complexity of flavor rather than the subtle distinctions that other culinary traditions might prize. There would be vegetables, but these were not the centerpiece of the meal as meat was. They served as accompaniments, as palate cleansers, as contrasts to the richness of the meat courses. And there would be bread throughout, used to sop up sauces, to provide bulk, to serve as an edible utensil since Romans ate primarily with their fingers, using spoons for liquid dishes but otherwise relying on their hands, tearing meat, picking up morsels, bringing food to their mouths in the reclining position they maintained throughout the meal. Finally would come the dessert course, the secunda mensa, consisting primarily of fruit and nuts. Fresh fruit if it was in season, dried fruit otherwise, figs and dates being particularly prized. Honey cakes might be served, sweetened with the only sweetener Romans had in abundance, flavored with spices, rich and satisfying as a conclusion to the elaborate meal. Throughout dinner, wine would flow freely, always diluted with water but present in large quantities, the mixing of wine and water a task assigned to slaves who would gauge the proper proportions, who would refill cups as they were emptied, who would ensure that the conversation remained lubricated but that guests did not become offensively drunk, though the line between convivial intoxication and embarrassing excess was often crossed. The conversation during these dinner parties was as important as the food, perhaps more so. This was when business was discussed informally, when political alliances were forged or maintained, when cultural topics were debated, when the host could display not just his wealth but his education, his wit, his ability to gather interesting and important people around his table. A successful dinner party enhanced the host's reputation, demonstrated his position in society, fulfilled his obligations to his friends and clients while simultaneously advancing his own interests. Guests at these elaborate dinners might receive gifts, small tokens of the host's generosity, though there was also a practice that seems startling by modern standards. Guests might take leftovers home with them, wrapping choice pieces of meat or particularly fine delicacies in cloth napkins brought for that purpose. This was not considered rude or evidence of poverty but was actually expected, a sign that the host had provided so abundantly that there was more than enough for everyone, surplus that could be shared, food so fine that guests wanted to take some home to enjoy again or to share with family members who had not been present. For slaves serving at these dinners, the experience was entirely different. They would have eaten earlier, or would eat later, simple food prepared separately from the elaborate dishes served to the diners. They would stand throughout the meal, attentive to every need, ready to refill cups or bring new courses or respond to any request, their own hunger and fatigue irrelevant, their function purely to serve, to enable their master's entertainment, to remain invisible except when needed. As the meal concluded, as the last course was consumed and the conversation began to wind down, guests would prepare to depart. In winter, when darkness fell early, they might leave while some twilight remained. In summer, when days were long, dinner might extend into full darkness, the dining room lit by oil lamps, small clay or bronze vessels filled with olive oil, a wick floating in the oil providing a small, flickering flame. These oil lamps were the primary source of light after sunset throughout Rome, used in wealthy homes and poor apartments alike, though the quality and quantity varied enormously with wealth. A rich household might have dozens of lamps, elaborate bronze fixtures with multiple spouts, filling rooms with light, making it possible to continue activities well into the night. A poor household might have one or two simple clay lamps, providing barely enough light to navigate the apartment, certainly not enough for work or reading or any activity that required clear vision. The oil consumed by lamps represented a real expense, one that poor families could not always afford, and so many poorer Romans simply went to bed when darkness fell, or shortly thereafter. There was little point in staying awake in darkness, wasting expensive lamp oil, when you could sleep and preserve your resources for more necessary uses. Besides, the workday began before dawn, and rising early required retiring early, sleeping through the long hours of darkness, the body's rest aligning with the rhythms of the sun. For those who could afford to remain awake, who had sufficient lamp oil or candles, the evening hours might be spent in various pursuits. Reading, if you were literate and had access to texts, unrolling scrolls, or turning pages of codices by flickering lamplight, straining your eyes but pursuing knowledge or entertainment through literature. Conversation with family members, the day's events discussed, plans made, the bonds of family maintained through talk. Quiet work, tasks that could be performed by lamplight, spinning or sewing or other handwork that filled the hours productively. But even for the wealthy, even for those with abundant lamp oil and no need to rise before dawn, the evening activities were limited compared to daytime. The light was poor, insufficient for detailed work or extensive reading. The city outside was dark, dangerous, not a place to venture without good reason. The streets, barely safe in daylight with their crowds and bustle, became threatening in darkness, home to criminals and violent gangs, to those whose business was conducted in shadows, away from the observation and judgment of respectable society. Rome at night was a different city, quieter but not silent, darker but not completely dark, less crowded but still inhabited by those whose work or circumstances kept them active after sunset. The night watchmen, the vigils, would patrol the streets, watching for fires, maintaining a minimal level of order, their presence reassuring to those who encountered them but insufficient to make the nighttime streets truly safe. The bakers would be working, as we have seen, their ovens glowing in the darkness, the smell of bread beginning to drift through the streets in the hours before dawn. And there were the poor souls who worked through the night soil collectors who cleaned the public latrines, the carters whose rumbling passage through the dark streets would disturb the sleep of thousands, the prostitutes who worked the streets and taverns, selling their bodies to whoever would pay, their presence a reminder of the desperation that poverty could produce, the choices that limited options forced upon people. But for most Romans, night meant sleep, meant retreating to their beds or sleeping couches, meant pulling blankets over themselves if the weather was cold, lying nearly naked if summer heat made covering unbearable. Meant closing their eyes and surrendering to unconsciousness, to dreams or dreamless sleep, to the rest that their bodies demanded after the labors and activities of the day. The sounds of the city would continue through the night, never completely ceasing, the rumble of carts and the distant shouts and the occasional scream or crash that suggested violence or accident somewhere in the darkness. But these sounds would fade into background noise for those accustomed to them, would become part of the texture of sleep rather than disturbances that prevented it. And as Romans slept, as darkness covered the city and the stars wheeled overhead in patterns the ancients had observed for centuries, as the moon rose and set or remained hidden depending on its phase, the day that had begun before dawn finally came to its end. The cycle was complete, from the first sounds of carts and bakers to the final conversations in lamplit rooms, from breakfast of bread and wine to the elaborate cena of the wealthy or the simple supper of the poor, from morning labor to afternoon leisure to evening rest. Tomorrow would bring it all again, the same rhythms, the same obligations, the same pleasures and hardships and routines. This was daily life in ancient Rome, endlessly repeating, each day distinct in its details but similar in its structure, the million inhabitants of the city each living their individual lives while collectively creating the vast, complex, contradictory organism that was Rome itself, the greatest city the ancient world had ever known, magnificent and squalid, sophisticated and brutal, a place where humanity in all its variety was concentrated and displayed, where the heights of civilization and the depths of degradation existed side by side, where every day brought both wonder and suffering, triumph and tragedy, the extraordinary and the ordinary intermingled in ways that defined what it meant to be Roman, to live in Rome, to experience daily life in the ancient world's most powerful and enduring city. As the last lamps were extinguished in the homes of those who could afford to burn them late, as families settled into sleep and the sounds of domestic life faded into silence, Rome entered its most dangerous hours. The darkness that descended upon the city was not the comfortable darkness of a well-lit modern metropolis, where streetlights banish shadows and electric glow makes night nearly as bright as day. Roman darkness was profound, broken only by the occasional lamp in a window, by the moon when it was full and the sky was clear, by the stars whose light was too faint to illuminate the narrow streets and alleyways that twisted through the city like a labyrinth. In this darkness, the streets belonged to those whose business could not or would not wait for daylight. The criminals who prowled looking for opportunities, for unlocked doors or unguarded shops, for lone travelers foolish enough to venture out without protection. The gangs of young men, often from wealthy families, who roamed the streets looking for trouble, for entertainment found in violence and intimidation, treating the nighttime city as their private playground where they could act out their aggressions without the constraints that daylight and witnesses imposed. Respectable people did not go out at night if they could avoid it. To be found in the streets after dark was to invite suspicion, to mark yourself as either desperate or disreputable, someone whose business was questionable, whose purposes were probably not innocent. If you had to go out, if some urgent matter demanded nighttime travel through the city, you went accompanied, brought slaves or hired guards, carried weapons, moved quickly and carefully, aware that danger might lurk in every shadow, around every corner. The darkness itself was disorienting. The streets that were confusing enough in daylight, with their irregular layouts and their lack of clear signage or systematic organization, became nearly impossible to navigate at night. Even residents who knew their neighborhoods well could become lost in the darkness, could take wrong turns, could find themselves in unfamiliar and potentially dangerous areas. Visitors to the city, strangers who didn't know the layout, would not even attempt to move through Rome at night, would remain wherever they were staying until dawn made travel possible again. But if crime and violence were threats that Rome's residents learned to manage through caution and avoidance, there was another danger that no amount of care could fully prevent, a threat that hung over the city every night, that could strike without warning and spread with terrifying speed. Fire. In a city built largely of wood, where cooking was done over open flames, where oil lamps provided the only light, where buildings were pressed together so tightly that flames could leap from one structure to the next, where water was not readily available on the upper floors where fires often started, conflagration was a constant nightmare. Every Roman knew stories of fires that had consumed entire neighborhoods, that had left thousands homeless, that had killed those trapped on upper floors with no escape route, that had destroyed fortunes and lives in a matter of hours. The risk was greatest in the insulae, those crowded apartment buildings where the poor lived stacked above one another, where the construction was shoddy and the materials cheap, where overcrowding meant that a fire starting in one apartment could spread to dozens of others almost instantly. A knocked-over lamp, a cooking fire left unattended, a spark from a brazier used for heat landing on dry wood, any of these could begin a fire that would race through a building faster than people could flee. The narrow staircases became death traps, filled with smoke, blocked by panicked residents trying to escape, the flames spreading up through the wooden structure faster than people could descend. Those on the upper floors faced impossible choices. Stay and die from smoke or flames, or jump from windows too high for survival, or attempt to descend stairs already filled with fire, knowing that the chances of escape were minimal. And once a fire started in an insula, it rarely remained confined to that single building. The structures were too close together, the flames too fierce, the wind too likely to carry sparks and burning debris to neighboring buildings. A fire in one insula could spread to an entire block, could consume whole neighborhoods before it was brought under control or simply burned itself out, having consumed everything combustible in its path. Against this threat, Rome had organized a response, a force of men whose job was to fight fires and maintain order in the dangerous nighttime hours. These were the Vigils, the Watchmen, a paramilitary organization of freedmen organized into cohorts, stationed throughout the city, equipped with basic firefighting equipment and charged with the responsibility of protecting Rome from its own combustibility. The Vigils would patrol the streets at night, moving in groups for safety, watching for the first signs of fire, the glow of flames, the smell of smoke, the sounds of panic that might indicate a blaze had started. When they detected a fire, they would respond as quickly as possible, rushing to the scene with their equipment, their buckets and poles and pumps, their vinegar-soaked blankets that could be used to smother flames. Their methods were crude by modern standards but represented the best technology available at the time. They would form bucket brigades if water was available, passing containers of water from hand to throw on the flames. They would use pumps, simple devices that could spray water with some force, though not with the pressure or volume that modern fire equipment can achieve. They would pull down buildings adjacent to the fire, creating fire breaks, sacrificing structures not yet burning to prevent the spread of flames to areas beyond. Sometimes their efforts were successful, the fire contained before it could spread widely, the damage limited to a single building or a few apartments. But often, despite their best efforts, the fires raged beyond control, the Vigils able to do little more than watch and try to guide residents to safety, to prevent looting, to maintain some semblance of order in the chaos. When a major fire broke out, when entire neighborhoods were threatened, the response would expand beyond the vigils. Residents would fight to save their own homes and possessions, would form their own bucket brigades, would work desperately to contain the flames that threatened to consume everything they owned. Soldiers might be called in to help with demolition, to pull down buildings that stood in the fire's path, to maintain order and prevent the panic that could make a bad situation worse. And through it all, the night would be lit by the terrible glow of flames, the darkness replaced by a flickering orange light that could be seen across the city, that brought people out of their homes to watch in horror and fascination, grateful that it was not their neighborhood burning, not their homes and possessions being consumed, but knowing that next time, it might be. The morning after a major fire would reveal the devastation. Buildings reduced to charred ruins, walls still standing but everything inside them destroyed. Bodies being pulled from the wreckage, those who had not escaped, who had died from smoke or flames or from falls while trying to flee. Families standing in the streets with whatever possessions they had managed to save, now homeless, facing the prospect of rebuilding or, more likely, of finding new accommodations in a city where housing was already scarce and expensive. But most nights, most blessed nights, there were no major fires, only the constant low-level threat, the awareness that it could happen at any time, that the city was always one carelessly placed lamp away from disaster. And so Romans slept, or tried to sleep, in their wooden buildings, in their apartments high above the street, knowing the risks, accepting them as they accepted all the other dangers and discomforts of urban life, because there was no alternative, because this was where they lived, where their lives were, where they had to make the best of circumstances they could not control. The vigils would continue their patrols through the long hours of darkness, moving through the silent streets, watching, listening, ready to respond to fires or to crimes, providing what minimal security was possible in a city too large to police effectively, too combustible to be truly safe. Their presence was reassuring to those aware of it, a reminder that someone was watching, that the city had not been completely abandoned to darkness and danger and the whims of chance. And gradually, imperceptibly at first, the darkness would begin to ease. The sky in the east would shift from black to the deepest blue, then to lighter shades as dawn approached. The stars would fade, their light overwhelmed by the coming sun. The city would begin to stir, the earliest risers emerging to begin their work, the bakers' ovens already glowing, the first carts beginning their rumbling passage through the streets. The dangerous hours of night would give way once more to the relative safety of daylight. The criminals would retreat to wherever they spent their days. The vigils would return to their stations, their night's work complete. The fires that had not happened, the violence that had not occurred, would not be remarked upon, because the absence of disaster is not news, is not story, is simply the normal state of affairs that Romans hoped for every night and were grateful for every morning. And the city would awaken, would begin again the daily cycle that had repeated for centuries, that would continue for centuries more. The same routines, the same obligations, the same rhythms of work and rest, of labor and leisure, of public spectacle and private life. The same social hierarchies, the same inequalities, the same mixture of magnificence and squalor that defined Rome, that made it both the greatest city in the world and a place of extraordinary hardship for most of its inhabitants. Daily life in ancient Rome was structured, communal, shaped profoundly by class and tradition and the weight of centuries of accumulated custom and law. From the earliest morning prayers offered at household shrines to the dark, watchful hours when vigils patrolled the streets, Roman life followed a rhythm that was both rigid and familiar, both constraining and comforting in its predictability. The patrician in his domus and the tenant in his upper-floor apartment, the slave hauling water and the senator being attended by slaves, the child learning to read and the apprentice learning a trade, the chariot fan cheering in the Circus Maximus and the dinner guest reclining at an elaborate feast, all of them were Romans, all of them participants in this vast, complex urban civilization, all of them shaped by it and contributing to it, living their individual lives within the framework of social structures and expectations that had endured for generations and would continue to endure long after any individual life had ended. This was Rome, a place of extraordinary achievement and casual cruelty, a society that produced magnificent architecture and literature and law while depending fundamentally on slavery and conquest. A city that fed 1 million people while leaving many of them perpetually on the edge of starvation. A civilization that valued order and tradition while embracing spectacular violence as entertainment. To understand daily life in ancient Rome is to understand these contradictions, to see both the grandeur and the misery, to appreciate the genuine accomplishments while not looking away from the suffering and injustice upon which they were built. It is to recognize that the Romans were people like us, with the same basic needs and desires, the same capacity for kindness and cruelty, the same mixture of noble aspiration and base motivation. They lived differently, thought differently in some ways, inhabited a world whose assumptions and structures were foreign to our own. But they were human, and their daily lives, in all their complexity and difficulty and occasional joy, can still speak to us across the centuries, can remind us of both how much has changed and how much remains constant in the human experience. And so, as we imagine the last Roman finally drifting off to sleep, as the city settles into the deepest hour of night, we can rest knowing that in a few short hours, it will all begin again. The sun will rise over the 7 hills. The bakers will pull the first loaves from their ovens. The water carriers will gather at the fountains. The patrons will receive their clients. The shops will open, the schools will fill with students, the markets will bustle with vendors and customers. Rome will awaken, and another day will unfold, similar to the one that came before and to the one that will come after, part of an endless cycle that was daily life in the ancient world's greatest city. And now, as our quiet journey through ancient Rome comes to a close, you can allow the last images to slowly fade. The streets have grown still, the lamps have dimmed, and the city rests beneath the night sky. There's nothing more you need to listen for, nothing you need to hold on to. If you're still awake, you may continue resting here for a while, or you can gently drift into sleep, carrying these calm moments with you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening. Rest well and sleep peacefully.